They called her the ugly daughter, the mistake, the one no man would ever want. Eleanor Hale's sisters thought it would be the perfect joke, answering a mail-order bride advertisement in her name, watching her face crumble when the inevitable rejection arrived. They never imagined a wealthy Wyoming rancher would actually say yes. Now Eleanor stands at a crossroads. Stay in a home where she's invisible, or marry a complete stranger 2,000 miles away. The proposal was meant to humiliate her. Instead, it might just set her free. Stay with me until the end of this story and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far Eleanor's journey has traveled. The parlor of the Hale household smelled of rosewater and resentment. Eleanor sat in the corner by the window, her needle moving through fabric with the mechanical precision of someone who had long ago learned to make herself small. Invisible. The afternoon light caught the dust motes dancing above her sisters' heads as they laughed, that particular crystalline sound that had followed Eleanor through 23 years of life like a persistent shadow. "Did you see Mrs. Pemberton's face when Catherine walked into church?" Violet was saying, her blonde curls bouncing as she gestured dramatically. "I thought the poor woman would faint dead away. She'd been telling everyone her daughter would catch Thomas Whitmore's eye, and then Catherine appears in that blue dress. The one that matches her eyes perfectly," Catherine interrupted, examining her reflection in the silver tea service. "I couldn't very well help it if Thomas spent the entire sermon staring at our pew." Margaret, the eldest at 26, smiled indulgently at her younger sisters. "You'll have every eligible man in Missouri proposing by summer's end. Both of you." Her eyes flickered toward Eleanor just for a moment before returning to her embroidery. "Mother says we must have at least 2 weddings before the year is out. The house simply cannot accommodate so many unmarried daughters indefinitely." The unspoken words hung in the air like smoke. Some daughters, anyway. Eleanor kept her eyes on her stitching. She had learned long ago not to react. Reaction gave them ammunition, and they had quite enough already. Plain Eleanor. Poor Eleanor. Eleanor with her mousy brown hair and forgettable features, her nose too long, her mouth too wide, her figure too thin. Eleanor, who read too much and spoke too little, who preferred the company of books to people, and had never once inspired a second glance from any man in town. Eleanor, the mistake that reminded everyone how very beautiful her sisters were by contrast. "Speaking of proposals," Violet said suddenly, a dangerous glint in her eye that Eleanor recognized immediately. It was the look that preceded trouble. "Did you see that advertisement in Father's newspaper, the one from out west?" Catherine's interest sharpened. "Which one?" "Some rancher in Wyoming territory looking for a mail-order bride." Violet's voice dripped with theatrical disdain. "Can you imagine? Having to advertise for a wife like one would advertise for livestock. How desperately pathetic must a man be?" "Or how desperately ugly," Catherine added, and they both dissolved into giggles. Margaret set down her embroidery with a thoughtful expression. "Let me see it." Violet retrieved the newspaper from the side table, folding it to reveal the advertisement in question. The 3 sisters huddled around it, reading aloud in exaggerated voices. "Respectable rancher, Wyoming territory, seeks honest woman of good character for marriage. Must be hardworking, practical, and willing to embrace frontier life. Age 20 to 30. Beauty less important than integrity and capability. Serious inquiries only. Reply to C. Ridgway, Sweetwater Station, Wyoming territory." "Beauty less important than integrity," Catherine read, her voice mocking. "What he means is, I'm so hideous and poor that no woman will have me, so I'll pretend I don't care about looks." "Or he's 70 years old and toothless," Violet suggested, "or scarred by smallpox. Or he smells like cattle and bourbon." They laughed again, the sound grating against Eleanor's nerves like sandpaper. She focused on her needlework, creating tiny, perfect stitches in a sampler no one would ever notice or admire. "You know," Margaret said slowly, and something in her tone made Eleanor's hands still. "It does say serious inquiries only." Violet caught on immediately. "Oh, Margaret, you're not suggesting—" "Why not?" Margaret's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Someone should answer it, as a social experiment, to see what sort of desperate creature would actually resort to advertising for a wife." "But who would we say is writing?" Catherine asked, leaning forward. The 3 of them turned to look at Eleanor simultaneously. The needle slipped, pricking Eleanor's finger. A small drop of blood welled up, bright red against her pale skin. She pressed it against her dress, leaving a tiny stain that would never completely wash out. "No," Eleanor said quietly. "Oh, Eleanor, don't be such a spoil-sport." Violet moved closer, her skirts rustling. "It's just a bit of fun. We'll write a letter in your name, and when he replies, if he replies, we'll all have a good laugh." "And if he doesn't reply," Catherine added, "well, that tells us something too, doesn't it?" Eleanor met her sister's eyes. The cruelty there was casual, thoughtless, which somehow made it worse than if it had been deliberate. To Catherine, this was merely entertainment, a way to pass a dull afternoon. The fact that it would humiliate Eleanor was simply incidental. "I said no." "You don't have a choice, dear sister." Margaret's voice was gentle, which made it more menacing. "Unless you'd like Father to know about the book you ordered from Boston, the one hidden under your mattress. I'm sure he'd be very interested to learn his daughter is reading such progressive ideas about women's suffrage and education." Eleanor's blood ran cold. That book, The Subjection of Women by John Stuart Mill, had cost her 3 months of carefully saved pin money. It was her secret treasure, her window into a world where women might be valued for their minds rather than their faces. "That's blackmail," Eleanor said. "That's family," Violet replied cheerfully. The sisters set to work immediately, clearing space at the writing desk with the enthusiasm of children planning mischief. Eleanor remained in her corner, her hands trembling too much to continue sewing, watching as they crafted what they clearly believed would be the joke of the season. "Dear Mr. Ridgway," Violet began, her pen scratching across expensive stationery, "I am writing in response to your advertisement." "Make it earnest," Margaret instructed. "Sincere. We want him to believe it's real. I am a woman of 23 years, currently residing in Missouri. I have lived all my life in relative comfort, but find myself yearning for a more purposeful existence." Catherine peered over Violet's shoulder. "Oh, that's good. Very noble." "I am not a beauty," Violet continued writing, "but I am healthy and capable. I can read and write, manage a household, and I am not afraid of hard work." "Don't make her sound too accomplished," Margaret warned. "We want him to reply, not suspect it's a joke." They labored over the letter for nearly an hour, crafting each sentence to sound genuine while simultaneously painting Eleanor as exactly the sort of plain, desperate spinster they imagined would answer such an advertisement. They included no daguerreotype. "We'll say the expense was too dear," Catherine suggested, and ended with a request for information about Mr. Ridgway's circumstances and expectations. Violet signed Eleanor's name with a flourish. "Now we just need to post it," Margaret said, folding the letter into an envelope. "I'll do it tomorrow," Violet volunteered. "I'm going into town anyway to meet Thomas Whitmore's sister for tea, though of course, I'll actually be meeting Thomas." She winked at Catherine. Eleanor watched all of this with a strange sense of detachment, as though she were observing the scene from a great distance. This was not the first time her sisters had used her as the butt of their jokes. There had been the time they'd told everyone she'd written a love poem to the minister's son, the time they'd accidentally spilled ink all over her best dress right before a party, the time they'd convinced a traveling salesman she was interested in courting just to watch her stammer and flee. But this felt different. This felt crueler somehow, more permanent. "Don't look so tragic, Eleanor," Margaret said, noticing her expression. "Nothing will come of it. Men like that probably receive hundreds of replies. If he responds at all, it will be months from now, and we'll have long forgotten about the whole thing." But Margaret was wrong. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived. Baz. Eleanor was in the kitchen garden when she heard the commotion inside the house. She'd been pulling weeds from between the herb beds, enjoying the rare solitude and the smell of thyme crushed between her fingers. Her hands were dirty, her dress smudged with soil, and for a brief moment she'd felt almost peaceful. Then Violet's shriek shattered the quiet. "It came! Margaret, Catherine, it actually came!" Eleanor straightened slowly, her heart beginning to pound. She knew, even before she walked inside, what had arrived. The 3 sisters were clustered in the parlor again, the letter spread open on the tea table like a treasure map. Their mother, usually confined to her rooms with what she called her delicate constitution, had actually come downstairs, her lace cap slightly askew. "Read it again," Mrs. Hale demanded. her voice sharp with curiosity. Violet cleared her throat dramatically. Dear Miss Hale, I received your letter with interest. I am not a man given to flowery language or false sentiment, so I will be direct. I am 34 years old and own a cattle ranch of approximately 2,000 acres in Wyoming Territory. The ranch is profitable and well established. I have a son, aged 7, who requires a mother's care. My wife passed 3 years ago, and the boy has been raised primarily by ranch hands and our housekeeper. Good people, but not family. I am not looking for romance or passion. I am looking for partnership. A woman who can manage a household, help raise a child, and stand beside me in building something lasting. The work is hard. The winters are brutal. The isolation can be overwhelming for those unaccustomed to frontier life. But if you are truly seeking purpose, as you wrote, I can offer that. I can offer respect, security, and a home where your contributions would matter. Where you would matter. I am not a handsome man, nor a cultured one. I smell of cattle and leather more often than I'd like. I have little patience for frivolity and less for dishonesty. But I keep my word. I provide for those under my protection, and I have built something here worth building. If this life appeals to you, write back. Tell me more about yourself, the truth, not what you think I want to hear. Tell me your expectations, your fears, your capabilities. If it does not appeal to you, I thank you for your consideration and wish you well. Respectfully, Caleb Ridgway. The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Hale spoke first. 2,000 acres? Her tone had shifted from amused to calculating. That's quite substantial. And profitable, Margaret added, scanning the letter again. He says it's well established. He has a child, Catherine said, wrinkling her nose. A 7-year-old boy. Can you imagine? Instant motherhood to someone else's spawn. But Violet was frowning. This doesn't sound like the letter of a desperate man. He sounds almost respectable. Eleanor, still standing in the doorway with dirt under her fingernails, finally found her voice. You're not actually considering this. 4 heads turned toward her. Don't be absurd, Margaret said quickly. Of course not. It's still a joke. It's just not the joke we expected. We should write back, Violet decided suddenly. Make it more ridiculous. See how far we can push it before he realizes he's being mocked. No, Eleanor said, more firmly this time. You've had your fun. Let it end here. Our fun? Catherine's laugh was brittle. Eleanor, dear, you can't possibly think we'd actually… Let me see the letter. The request surprised everyone, including Eleanor herself. But she walked forward, hand extended, and after a moment's hesitation, Violet handed it over. The paper was thick, good quality, but not ostentatious. The handwriting was clear and straightforward, the hand of someone accustomed to signing documents and keeping records. Eleanor read it once, then again, her eyes catching on certain phrases. Where you would matter, the truth, not what you think I want to hear. I keep my word. Something shifted in her chest. Something dangerous. Well, Mrs. Hale demanded, what do you think of your suitor, Eleanor? The mockery in her mother's voice should have stung. Instead, Eleanor felt oddly numb. I think, she said slowly, that he sounds honest. Violet giggled. Honest about being a rough frontier rancher who smells like cattle, perhaps. Better than being dishonest about being a gentleman, Eleanor replied, and was rewarded by the flash of irritation in her sister's eyes. Their father appeared in the doorway, newspaper tucked under his arm. What's all this commotion? Oh, Father, it's too funny, Catherine began, but Mrs. Hale cut her off with a sharp gesture. Eleanor has received a proposal of marriage from a Wyoming rancher, she said, her tone measured. A man of substantial property, apparently. Mr. Hale's eyebrows rose. He looked at Eleanor, really looked at her, for perhaps the first time in months. Is that so? It was a joke, Eleanor said quietly. The girls wrote to him as a prank. But he replied seriously, Margaret added. Very seriously. Mr. Hale held out his hand for the letter. He read it in silence, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he folded it carefully and handed it back to Eleanor. 2,000 acres, he said finally. That's not a small operation. A man with that kind of property. He trailed off, but Eleanor could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. She understood in that moment exactly how her father saw her, not as a daughter, as a problem to be solved, an expense to be eliminated, a burden that might, miraculously, be lifting itself. "You can't be serious, Father," Violet protested. "It's Wyoming territory. It's practically wilderness." "It's an opportunity," Mr. Hale corrected, "one that likely won't come again." He turned to Eleanor. "What do you think, daughter? Does frontier life appeal to you?" The question was a formality. She could see it in his face. He'd already decided. If she said yes, he'd encourage it. If she said no, well, he'd probably encourage it anyway. 3 daughters were expensive. 3 dowries were impossible. The Hale fortune, once substantial, had dwindled over the years through poor investments and Mr. Hale's fondness for cards. Violet and Catherine would marry well. Their beauty would ensure that. Margaret might make an acceptable match. But Eleanor? Eleanor was a drain on resources with no return in sight. Eleanor started, then stopped. What did she think? She thought about her life in this house, the corner seat by the window, the constant comparisons, the way people's eyes slid past her to her beautiful sisters, the future stretching ahead, years of being the spinster aunt, the one who helped raise other people's children, who made herself useful in quiet, forgettable ways. She thought about the letter in her hands, where you would matter. "May I have time to consider?" she asked. "Of course," her father said, in a tone that meant but not too much time. "It's a significant decision." That night, Eleanor lay in her narrow bed, the letter hidden beneath her pillow alongside her forbidden book. The house was dark and quiet, her sisters asleep in their shared room down the hall. Through the thin walls, she could hear her parents' voices, her mother's sharp whisper, her father's low rumble. Solve the Eleanor problem quite neatly. Can't force the girl. Won't get another chance like this. Send her west to marry a stranger. Eleanor closed her eyes and tried to imagine it. Wyoming territory. Mountains and plains. A ranch house instead of this respectable Missouri townhouse. A 7-year-old boy who needed a mother. A man who smelled of cattle and leather and made no promises beyond respect and partnership. A life where she might matter. She thought about Caleb Ridgway's words. "Tell me the truth, not what you think I want to hear." No one had ever asked for her truth before. But the letter took Eleanor 3 days to write. She started it a dozen times, crumpling each attempt and hiding the evidence at the bottom of the trash bin where her sisters wouldn't find it. She didn't know what to say. How did one respond to a proposal that had started as a joke but had somehow become real? Finally, on the 3rd night, she lit a candle and wrote from the heart. "Dear Mr. Ridgway, I must begin with an apology and a confession. The first letter you received was not entirely my doing. My sisters wrote it as a jest, using my name without my knowledge or permission. I tell you this because you asked for truth, and I will not begin any correspondence, if we are to have one, with deception. However, having read your reply, I find myself considering seriously what began as their mockery. You ask about my expectations. I have few. I have lived 23 years in a house where I am valued primarily for my absence. I am the plain daughter, the one who fades into corners and is forgotten in conversations. I do not expect romance or passion. I do not expect to be treasured or admired, but I would very much like to be useful, to matter to someone, even in practical ways. You ask about my fears. I fear that I am not strong enough for frontier life. I fear that your son will see me as an interloper. I fear that I will fail you and prove my family right about my inadequacy. I fear that you will look at me and be disappointed, even though you claim beauty is not important. You ask about my capabilities. I can read and write, as you can see. I can manage a household and keep accounts. I am a good cook and a competent seamstress. I have helped raise younger cousins and am patient with children. I am healthy and rarely ill. I do not faint at the sight of blood or hard work. What I cannot promise is that I will not be afraid, or that I will not make mistakes, or that I will be everything you need me to be. But I can promise to try. If you are still interested after reading this honest account, please write again. Tell me about your son. Tell me about Wyoming. Tell me what I should expect if I am brave enough to come. Truthfully, Eleanor Hale. She posted the letter herself, walking into town alone and handing it to the postmaster before she could change her mind. Then she went home and waited. Her sisters had lost interest in the game. Catherine was engaged to Thomas Whitmore by then, and Violet was being courted by a banker's son from St. Louis. Margaret was entertaining a widower with 3 children and good prospects. The joke that was Eleanor's mail-order marriage had been eclipsed by real courtships, real futures. No one mentioned Caleb Ridgway or Wyoming Territory. Except at night, when Eleanor lay awake and imagined the letter traveling west, across rivers and plains and mountains, into the hands of a man who had asked for truth and might, impossibly, actually want hers. 6 weeks passed. Eleanor had almost convinced herself that no reply would come, that Caleb Ridgway had read her confession and decided, quite reasonably, that a woman who began with deception, even unintentional, was not worth pursuing. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, another letter arrived. This time, Eleanor was there when the post was delivered. She saw her name on the envelope, recognized the handwriting, and claimed it before anyone else could. "What's that?" Violet asked absently, arranging flowers in a vase. "Nothing important," Eleanor lied, and escaped to her room. Her hands shook as she broke the seal. "Dear Miss Hale, I appreciate your honesty, even though it reveals your sisters to be less kind than one would hope. I am not angry about the original deception. You were not party to it, and your confession speaks well of your character. You say you fear disappointment. I will tell you plainly, I am not a man who disappoints easily because I do not build expectations on sand. I need a partner, not a princess. I need someone who can work beside me, raise my son, and build a life in difficult country. Beauty fades. Character endures. My son's name is James. He is quiet, serious, and smart. He misses his mother but has learned not to speak of her because it pains the adults around him. He needs someone who will let him grieve while also helping him grow. He needs normal. He needs consistent. He needs what I cannot give him alone. Wyoming is harsh and beautiful in equal measure. The winters will test you. The isolation will challenge you. But the land gets into your blood. The sky is bigger here. The possibilities are wider. People are judged by what they do, not who their parents were or how they look. It is a place where you could build something real, what you should expect if you come. Hard work, long days, simple living, though comfortable enough. Ranch hands who may resent a woman's authority at first, but will respect you if you earn it. A community that is small but genuine. A husband who will treat you fairly, protect you fiercely, and expect the same in return. I am not offering romance, Miss Hale. I am offering partnership. But partnership, built right, can become something deeper. My parents had an arranged marriage. They ended their days devoted to each other. Not because they started with love, but because they built it, year by year, choice by choice. I will not pressure you. This is your decision. But if you are brave enough, and I suspect you are braver than you know, I would be honored to have you as my wife. If you accept, I will send money for your travel and a bank draft for your father's household, as is proper. We can marry here, in Sweetwater, when you arrive. I will give you a week after your arrival to change your mind if you find me or the circumstances unacceptable. You will have your return ticket and enough money to travel home if needed. I am not a man who makes promises lightly. I mean every word I write. Waiting for your answer, Caleb Ridgway. P.S. My son asks if you know any stories. He is learning to read but still prefers being read to at bedtime. It has been mostly cowboy tales and ranch accounts. He might benefit from something different. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, her eyes catching on different phrases each time. Braver than you know. Partnership, built right, can become something deeper. I mean every word I write. And that postscript, that small, vulnerable postscript about a 7-year-old boy who missed stories. She walked to her window and looked out at the familiar street, the respectable houses, the manicured gardens, the predictable, suffocating sameness of everything. Then she looked down at the letter in her hands. She thought about James, serious and quiet, missing his mother. She thought about Caleb Ridgway, who built partnerships instead of demanding romance. She thought about wide skies and possibilities. She thought about mattering. Eleanor sat at her small writing desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. Her hand was steady as she wrote, Dear Mr. Ridgway, yes, I know many stories. When should I come? Eleanor. She posted it the next morning. Then she went home and told her family she was getting married. The explosion was immediate and spectacular. Absolutely not, Mrs. Hale declared, rising from her fainting couch with more energy than she'd shown in months. I will not allow it. Wyoming territory? You'll be killed by Indians or bears or desperados. The girl has lost her mind, Mr. Hale muttered, though Eleanor noted he didn't actually forbid it. Her sisters reacted with varying degrees of shock and schadenfreude. You're actually going through with it? Violet looked genuinely stunned. Eleanor, it was a joke. You never meant for me to have an opportunity, Eleanor interrupted quietly. But I have one now, and I'm taking it. You don't even know what he looks like, Catherine protested. And he doesn't know what I look like, Eleanor replied. We'll be equals in our ignorance. Margaret was the only one who seemed to understand. She studied Eleanor for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You've changed your mind about something. Or perhaps you finally made it up. Perhaps, Eleanor agreed. The argument raged for 3 days. Mrs. Hale took to her bed with palpitations. Mr. Hale paced and muttered about propriety and hasty decisions. Her sisters alternated between mockery and genuine concern, but Eleanor had made her choice. When Caleb's response arrived with travel money and detailed instructions, Mr. Hale finally capitulated. The bank draft was generous, enough to soothe his conscience about sending his daughter west to marry a stranger, enough to pay for Catherine's wedding dress and Violet's trousseau, enough to make Eleanor's departure convenient. She had 2 weeks to prepare. Catherine's wedding was rushed forward. No one wanted the embarrassment of Eleanor leaving first, making her marriage the main topic of gossip. On a golden October morning, Eleanor stood in the back of the church and watched her beautiful sister marry Thomas Whitmore. She saw the way people looked at Catherine, with admiration, envy, approval. No one looked at Eleanor at all. That night, at the wedding breakfast, she overheard Mrs. Whitmore talking to a friend. Such a shame about the middle daughter, the woman said, her voice carrying across the room. Plain as paste, poor thing. At least she's found someone willing to take her, even if he is some rough frontier nobody. Eleanor waited for the familiar sting of shame. It didn't come. Instead, she felt oddly free. Let them think Caleb Ridgway was a nobody. Let them pity her for accepting him. She knew something they didn't. For the first time in her life, someone had asked for her truth and listened to it. Someone had looked at what she could offer, not her face or her father's name, and found it valuable. That was more than any of these respectable people had ever given her. The night before her departure, Margaret came to her room. Eleanor was packing her trunk, folding the few dresses she owned, the books she couldn't bear to leave behind. Are you frightened? Margaret asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. Terrified, Eleanor admitted. Then why go? Eleanor paused, holding one of her mother's old shawls. Because I'm more frightened of staying. Of becoming 40-year-old Aunt Eleanor, living in corners, forgotten and forgettable. She looked at her sister. You'll marry your widower. You'll have his children and his household to manage. Catherine and Violet will have their own homes, their own lives. And I'll be... what? The spinster sister visiting at holidays, useful only for minding babies and running errands? Margaret's silence was answer enough. At least in Wyoming, Eleanor continued, I'll have purpose. I'll matter to someone, even if it's only in practical ways. He could be cruel, Margaret warned. He could be a drunkard or a tyrant. You have no way of knowing. I know he asked for truth, Eleanor said simply. I know he offered me a way out if I'm unhappy. I know he cares about his son. I know he writes honest letters. She met Margaret's eyes. That's more than most women know before they marry. Margaret nodded slowly. You're braver than I thought, Eleanor. Braver than any of us. Or more desperate. Perhaps both. They sat in silence for a moment, two sisters who had never been close, finding unexpected understanding in a shared moment of honesty. Will you write? Margaret asked finally. If you'll read the letters, Eleanor replied. I will, I promise. They embraced, awkwardly, and then Margaret left. Eleanor finished her packing alone, tucking Caleb's letters into her traveling bag where she could read them on the journey. Morning came too quickly. The whole family gathered to see her off, less out of affection than propriety. The train station was crowded with people, none of whom seemed to notice the plain young woman boarding the westbound train with a single trunk and a carpet bag. Her father shook her hand formally. "Right when you arrive. Let us know you're safe." Her mother dabbed at dry eyes with a handkerchief. "Try not to embarrass us, Eleanor." Catherine and Violet hugged her briefly, already distracted by their own concerns. Only Margaret held on a moment longer. "Be happy," she whispered, "or at least be free." Then Eleanor was climbing aboard, finding her seat, watching through the window as her family grew smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely. The train lurched forward. Missouri began to fall away behind her. Eleanor pulled out Caleb's most recent letter, the one that had arrived yesterday, telling her he would meet her at Sweetwater Station in 6 days, that James was excited to meet her, that the ranch was prepared for her arrival, that he was looking forward to their partnership. She read it 3 times as the landscape changed outside her window. Trees gave way to prairie. Towns grew smaller and farther apart. The sky expanded until it seemed to swallow everything. Eleanor Hale was traveling toward a man she'd never met, to marry him and raise his child and build a life in country she'd never seen. It had started as a cruel joke. Her sisters had meant to humiliate her, to make her the laughingstock of their social circle. Instead, they had given her an escape route, and Eleanor, the plain daughter, the forgotten one, the woman who had spent 23 years being invisible, was brave enough to take it. The train carried her west toward wide skies and possibilities, toward a 7-year-old boy who liked stories and a rancher who valued truth over beauty, toward a future that was uncertain, frightening, and entirely her own. For the first time in her life, Eleanor smiled at her reflection in the train window. She wasn't beautiful. She would never be beautiful. But perhaps, in Wyoming, with a man who had asked for her truth and a child who needed her stories, she might become something better. She might become necessary. She might become seen. The journey took 6 days, and each one carried Eleanor further from everything she had known. The first day, she kept expecting someone to stop the train, to drag her back to Missouri, and tell her this had all been a terrible mistake. But the train kept moving, mile after relentless mile, and slowly Eleanor began to believe she might actually be free. She shared her compartment with a traveling salesman and an older woman named Mrs. Chen, who was returning to her son's store in Cheyenne. The salesman lost interest in conversation when he realized Eleanor wasn't a potential customer, but Mrs. Chen proved to be unexpectedly kind. "You traveling alone, dear?" the older woman asked on the second day, her accent flavored with something Eleanor couldn't quite place, perhaps Chinese mixed with decades of American territories. "Yes, ma'am." "That's brave. Or foolish." Mrs. Chen's eyes were sharp but not unkind. "Which is it?" Eleanor considered the question. "I haven't decided yet." That made the older woman laugh, a sound like wind chimes. "Honest answer. I like that." She pulled out a package wrapped in brown paper. "Here. You look like you could use some real food. Train dining car charges too much for food that tastes like cardboard." Inside the package were rice balls wrapped in seaweed and some kind of sweet bean pastry. Eleanor had never seen food like it before, but her stomach was growling and Mrs. Chen was watching expectantly. The rice was sticky and slightly vinegared, nothing like anything she'd eaten in Missouri. It was delicious. "Thank you," Eleanor said, surprised by how hungry she'd been. "You running from something or toward something?" Mrs. Chen asked, biting into her own rice ball. "Both, I think." "Smart girl." The older woman nodded approvingly. "The best journeys are always both. You got people waiting for you out west?" "A husband," Eleanor said, the word strange in her mouth. "Well, he will be my husband when I arrive." Mrs. Chen's eyebrows rose. "Mail-order bride?" Eleanor flushed but nodded. "Nothing to be ashamed of," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "My own marriage was arranged. 43 years we had together before he passed. Good years, mostly. Hard ones too, but good." She leaned forward. "You know what makes a marriage work, especially one that starts practical instead of romantic?" "What?" "Both people deciding, every single day, to choose the partnership. Love isn't something that just happens to you like weather. It's something you build brick by brick, choice by choice. She patted Eleanor's hand. You remember that when things get hard, because they will get hard. Eleanor thought about that conversation as the train rolled through Kansas, through Colorado, through country that grew progressively wilder and more beautiful. She watched the landscape change outside her window, the green giving way to gold, the farms growing sparse, the mountains rising in the distance like promises or warnings. At night, alone in her sleeping berth, she reread Caleb's letters by lamplight. She studied his handwriting, looking for clues to the man she would marry. The letters were carefully written but not flowery, practical but not cold. He wrote about the ranch, the cattle, the horses, the spring calving season that had been particularly successful. He wrote about James, who had asked whether Eleanor knew any stories about dragons. I told him you were educated and well-read, so probably yes, Caleb had written. I hope I haven't overpromised. Eleanor smiled at that. She did know stories about dragons. She knew stories about everything. Years of reading had given her that, at least. She might not be beautiful or charming, but she could give a lonely 7-year-old boy stories. That was something. On the fourth day, the train stopped in Denver for several hours. Eleanor stepped onto the platform, grateful to stretch her legs. The air was thinner here, sharper, and the mountains loomed so close it seemed impossible they were real. In Missouri, the world had been flat and predictable. Here, everything was vertical and wild. First time seeing mountains? A man asked. He was leaning against the station wall, a star pinned to his vest, some kind of lawman. Yes, sir. They'll either make you feel small or make you feel free, he said, tipping his hat. Sometimes both at once. Eleanor understood what he meant. Standing there, looking at those impossible peaks, she felt both insignificant and liberated. The mountains didn't care who she was, or what she looked like, or whether her sisters were prettier. The mountains simply existed, vast and indifferent, and somehow that was comforting. She bought a sandwich from a vendor and ate it watching the mountains, storing up the sight for later, for when she might need to remember that the world was bigger than parlors and social hierarchies and cruel jokes. The train rolled on. By the fifth day, Eleanor's excitement had hardened into something more complex, a mixture of anticipation and dread that sat in her stomach like a stone. Tomorrow, she would arrive in Sweetwater. Tomorrow, she would meet Caleb Ridgway face to face. Tomorrow, her life would change irrevocably. You're looking pale, dear, Mrs. Chen observed. Second thoughts? Constant thoughts, Eleanor admitted. What if he takes one look at me and regrets everything? What if I can't do the work? What if his son hates me? What if the sun doesn't rise tomorrow? Mrs. Chen countered. You can't live your life on what-ifs. You made a choice. Now you see it through. She paused. But I'll tell you a secret. If he's the kind of man who judges you by your face instead of your character, you get on the next train east. A bad marriage is worse than no marriage at all. He said beauty wasn't important to him. Then trust that until he proves otherwise. Mrs. Chen squeezed her hand. I get off at Cheyenne, next stop. But you remember what I said. Choose the partnership every day. And don't let anyone, not even your husband, make you small. When the train pulled into Cheyenne, Mrs. Chen gathered her bags and turned back to Eleanor one last time. You're braver than you think you are, girl. You'll do fine. Then she was gone. And Eleanor was alone again. The last night on the train, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She lay in her berth watching darkness rush past the window, her mind spinning with possibilities. She tried to imagine what Caleb looked like, tall or short, dark or fair. Would he be stern or kind? Would his hands be gentle or rough? Would he look at her with disappointment? She thought about James, too, 7 years old, missing his mother, raised by ranch hands and housekeepers. What did a 7-year-old need? Patience, probably. Consistency. Stories about dragons. Eleanor could do that. She could be patient and consistent. She could tell stories. It would have to be enough. Dawn broke over Wyoming territory, and Eleanor pressed her face to the window, trying to see everything at once. The land here was different from anything she'd imagined. Vast and rolling, covered in sage and grass that seemed to go on forever. The sky was enormous, that particular blue that only existed where the air was thin and clean. Mrs. Chen's son's words came back to her. They'll either make you feel small or make you feel free. Eleanor felt both. The train began to slow. A sign flashed past. Sweetwater Station, population 247. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. No turning back now. She gathered her carpet bag with trembling hands, checking her reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin. The same plain face looked back at her. Mousy brown hair, too long nose, too wide mouth. She'd worn her best dress, a simple gray wool that had seemed appropriate for meeting one's future husband. Now it just seemed drab. Too late to worry about it now, she whispered to her reflection. The train jerked to a stop. Eleanor took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped into the aisle. The platform at Sweetwater Station was smaller than the one in Denver, just rough wooden planks in a tiny building that served as both ticket office and telegraph station. A handful of people were waiting, a family with several children, an older man in a suit, a couple of cowboys in dusty clothes, and a tall man standing slightly apart from the others, a small boy at his side. Eleanor knew him immediately, though she couldn't have said why. Maybe it was the way he stood, solid and still, like he was part of the landscape. Maybe it was the way the boy was holding his hand, trusting and nervous at once. Or maybe it was the way he was scanning the disembarking passengers with an expression Eleanor recognized, someone looking for something they weren't sure they'd recognize. She stepped down from the train, her legs unsteady after 6 days of travel. Her trunk was being unloaded behind her, but she couldn't look away from the man and the boy. Caleb Ridgway was not handsome, but he wasn't ugly either. He was simply solid. Probably 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face weathered by sun and wind. He wore clean but well-worn clothes, a cotton shirt, work pants, boots that had seen plenty of use. His hands, hanging at his sides, were scarred and calloused. He looked like a man who worked with those hands, who built things and mended things and didn't waste time on appearances. He looked honest. Their eyes met across the platform, and Eleanor saw the exact moment he recognized her. Not from description, they'd shared none, but from the simple fact that she was the only woman traveling alone who was looking at him with equal parts terror and hope. He said something to the boy, then walked toward her with steady, purposeful strides. The boy followed, half hiding behind his father's leg. Eleanor's mouth went dry. This was the moment. This was when he would see her clearly, in full daylight, and realize his mistake. Caleb stopped 3 feet away. His eyes swept over her once, quick, assessing, but not cruel. Then he met her gaze directly. "Miss Hale." His voice was deeper than she'd expected, rough from years of calling orders across open range. "Yes." Her own voice came out barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Yes." "Mr. Ridgway?" "Caleb," he corrected. "We're past formalities, I think." He gestured to the boy. "This is my son, James." Eleanor looked down at the child. He had his father's dark hair but lighter eyes, hazel or green, hard to tell in the morning light. He was studying her with the serious, measuring expression of a child who'd learned to be cautious. "Hello, James," she said, crouching down to his level. "I'm Eleanor. Your father told me you like stories." The boy's eyes widened slightly. "Do you know any good ones?" "I know hundreds," Eleanor said. "I brought 3 books with me. One of them has a story about a dragon who was afraid of heights." That got a small smile. "Dragons can fly. How can they be afraid of heights?" "That's what makes it interesting," Eleanor replied. "He has to face his fear to save his best friend." James considered this gravely. "I'd like to hear that story." "Then I'll read it to you tonight, if that's all right with your father." Caleb was watching this exchange with an unreadable expression. When Eleanor stood up again, he nodded once. "Your trunk?" "Being unloaded now, I think." "I'll get it." "James, stay with Miss Eleanor." He walked away before Eleanor could protest, leaving her alone with the boy. They looked at each other for a long moment. "Are you really going to marry my pa?" James asked finally. Eleanor chose honesty. "Yes, if he still wants to marry me after meeting me." "Why wouldn't he?" The question was so innocent, so devoid of the judgment Eleanor had lived with her entire life, that she almost laughed. "Some people might think I'm not Suitable. James frowned, clearly puzzled. Pa says suitable means right for the job. You can read and tell stories, and you came all the way from Missouri on the train by yourself. That seems pretty suitable. Out of the mouths of babes. Thank you, James. That's kind of you to say. I'm not being kind, I'm being factual. He said it so seriously that Eleanor did laugh then, surprised by the sound of her own amusement. Caleb returned carrying her trunk like it weighed nothing, which it definitely didn't. Wagon's this way, he said, jerking his head toward the edge of the platform. The wagon was sturdy and practical, pulled by two solid-looking horses. Caleb loaded her trunk into the back, then helped her up onto the bench seat with a hand that was gentle despite its calluses. James scrambled up between them. Ranch is about an hour's ride, Caleb said, taking up the reins. We can talk on the way or you can rest. Your choice. Eleanor was exhausted from travel, but she was also desperately curious. I'd like to talk if that's all right. Figured you would. He clicked to the horses and they started moving, leaving the little station behind. What do you want to know? Everything. Nothing. How to be a wife to a stranger. How to be a mother to a grieving child. How to survive in this wild country. Tell me about the ranch, she said instead. Caleb talked as he drove, his voice steady and factual. The ranch ran about 300 head of cattle, plus horses for working the herds. He employed 4 full-time hands and picked up additional help during spring calving and fall roundup. The house was solid timber built by his father 20 years ago. There was a barn, a bunkhouse for the hands, a smokehouse, a root cellar. It's not fancy, he said, but it's sound, keeps out the wind and the snow, and that's what matters out here. What about neighbors? Eleanor asked. Nearest ranch is 8 miles east. Town is 12 miles north, bigger than Sweetwater, with a school and a church and a general store. He glanced at her. It can be lonely, especially in winter. The hands are good men, but they keep to themselves mostly. And James here is at school during the week. There's a teacher who boards in town, teaches about 15 students. James piped up. Miss Patterson. She's nice, but she makes us do arithmetic every day. Arithmetic is important, Caleb said mildly. Not as important as recess, James muttered, making Eleanor smile. Do you have friends at school? She asked the boy. Some. Tommy Morrison and I are learning to rope. And there's Sarah Chen. Her pa runs the store. She's teaching me Chinese words, and I'm teaching her how to skip rocks. Sarah Chen. Eleanor's mind caught on the name. Is her grandmother? Probably the woman you met on the train, Caleb said. Mrs. Chen mentioned she'd shared her compartment with a young woman heading to Sweetwater. Small world out here. Eleanor felt a rush of warmth. Mrs. Chen's granddaughter. Maybe she'd have at least one friend in this new life. The landscape rolled past. Endless grass and sage, distant mountains, sky that went on forever. Occasionally they passed cattle bearing Caleb's brand, a simple CR. The animals lifted their heads to watch the wagon pass, then went back to grazing. What about church? Eleanor asked. I'm not particularly devout, but I grew up attending. There's a circuit preacher comes through twice a month, Caleb said. Services in the schoolhouse. It's less formal than what you're probably used to. But Reverend Thompson's a good man. They crested a rise and Caleb pulled the horses to a stop. There, he said, pointing. In the valley below, Eleanor could see buildings, a main house larger than she'd expected, with a porch that wrapped around 2 sides. A big barn, painted red. Several smaller structures scattered around. Fenced pastures with horses grazing. Beyond it all, a creek wound through cottonwood trees. It looked solid, real, like it had grown out of the land itself. That's home, Caleb said quietly. What do you think? Eleanor swallowed around the lump in her throat. It's beautiful. It's practical, he corrected, but she could hear the pride beneath the words. Come on. I imagine you'd like to wash up and rest before we talk about arrangements. He clicked to the horses, and they started down the slope toward the ranch. As they got closer, Eleanor could see more details. Chickens scratching in a yard, a vegetable garden, mostly harvested for the season, laundry hanging on a line, smoke rising from the chimney. A woman emerged from the house as they pulled up. Older, maybe 60, with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and an apron tied around her waist. She wiped her hands on a towel and waited, her expression reserved. "That's Mrs. Kowalski," Caleb said, helping Eleanor down from the wagon. "She's been keeping house since, well, for 3 years now. She lives in the small cabin out back." Mrs. Kowalski's eyes swept over Eleanor with the same assessing look Caleb had given her at the station, but with considerably less warmth. "So you came," the older woman said. "Not welcoming exactly, but not hostile either." "I did," Eleanor replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "Can you cook?" "Yes, ma'am." "Do laundry without ruining it?" "Yes, ma'am." "Handle a chicken that needs killing?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "I've done it before. I don't love it, but I can do it." Something shifted in Mrs. Kowalski's expression. "Well, that's honest, at least." She turned to Caleb. "I've got lunch ready. Figured you'd all be hungry after the drive." "Appreciate it," Caleb said. He looked at Eleanor. "I'll show you your room. You can rest before lunch if you need." "Your room, not our room." Eleanor felt a flutter of relief mixed with confusion. Caleb carried her trunk inside while James ran ahead, clearly excited to show her things. The house was indeed solid, rough timber walls, wide plank floors worn smooth with age and use. The main room served as kitchen and living area, with a big stone fireplace taking up one wall. Furniture was simple but well made. Everything was clean but lived in, with the kind of wear that came from actual use rather than neglect. "My room's upstairs," James announced, pointing. "And there's Pa's room, and the spare room, and the bathing room." Caleb led her up a narrow staircase to a hallway with 4 doors. He opened the second one, revealing a small but pleasant room with a real bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a window overlooking the front pasture. "This is yours," he said, setting her trunk at the foot of the bed. "For now, anyway. Until, well, we'll talk after lunch." He left quickly, clearly uncomfortable, leaving Eleanor alone in the room that was apparently hers. She sank onto the bed, her legs suddenly weak. This was real. She was here, in Wyoming, in this house, about to marry this man she'd known for less than 2 hours. What had she done? A soft knock interrupted her spiral. "Miss Eleanor?" James's voice came through the door. "Mrs. Kowalski says lunch is ready. She made fried chicken and biscuits." Eleanor took a deep breath, smoothed her dress, and opened the door. James was standing there with that serious expression, but his eyes were hopeful. "Will you sit next to me?" he asked. "I can tell you about the chickens. We have 23. I named all of them. How could she resist that? "I would love to hear about the chickens." His face lit up with the kind of smile that transformed his whole being, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. Whatever happened with Caleb, whatever challenges lay ahead, this child needed her, this serious, sweet boy who named chickens and wanted stories about dragons. That would have to be enough. Lunch was surprisingly comfortable. Mrs. Kowalski had set the table in the main room, and they ate together, Caleb, Eleanor, James, and the housekeeper herself. The food was simple but good, better than anything Eleanor had eaten on the train. James chattered about the chickens, the horses, school, and everything else, filling the silences that might otherwise have been awkward. Caleb listened with obvious affection, occasionally correcting his son's more exaggerated claims. "Blaze cannot jump the barn," he said mildly. "She's a good horse, but she's not magic." "She could if she wanted to," James insisted. "She just chooses not to." Eleanor hid her smile behind her napkin. After lunch, Mrs. Kowalski stood. "I'll clean up. Mr. Ridgway, perhaps you and Miss Hale should talk. Privately." It wasn't a suggestion. Caleb nodded and looked at Eleanor. "Will you walk with me?" Her heart began to pound again, but she nodded. They left James helping Mrs. Kowalski with dishes and walked outside toward the creek. The afternoon was warm for October, the sun bright overhead. Caleb walked with his hands in his pockets, his stride easy and unhurried. Eleanor matched his pace, waiting for him to speak first. "I want to be clear about expectations," he said finally. "So there's no misunderstandings." "All right. I offered you a week to change your mind. That offer stands. If you find me or this life unacceptable, I'll pay your way back to Missouri. No questions asked. And if I don't change my mind? He stopped walking and turned to face her. Then we get married. Reverend Thompson is coming through day after tomorrow. We can do it then, simple and quick. Eleanor's mouth was dry. And after that? After that, we build a partnership. His gaze was steady, unflinching. I need help with James. I need someone to manage the household so Mrs. Kowalski can retire. She's earned it. I need a partner who can handle the social side of things, the community obligations I'm terrible at. In return, I'll provide for you, protect you, and treat you with respect. What about... Eleanor hesitated, then forced herself to continue. What about marital relations? Caleb's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained calm. I won't force anything on you, ever. When and if you're ready for that aspect of marriage, you tell me. Until then, your room is your own. The relief that flooded through Eleanor was overwhelming. Thank you. Don't thank me for basic decency. He started walking again. I need you to understand something, Eleanor. I'm not an easy man. I work hard, I expect the same from others, and I don't have much patience for nonsense. I'm not romantic. I won't write you poetry or bring you flowers or any of that. I don't need poetry, Eleanor said quietly, but I keep my word. If I say I'll do something, I do it. If I make a promise, I keep it. He looked at her again. I promised you partnership and respect. You'll have both, as long as you hold up your end. Which is? Be a mother to James. Not his real mother. You can't replace Sarah, and I wouldn't ask you to try. But be someone he can count on. Someone constant. Caleb's voice roughened slightly. He's had too much loss already. He needs stability. I can do that, Eleanor said. I want to do that. They walked in silence for a while, following the creek toward a grove of cottonwoods. The sound of water over stones was soothing, and gradually Eleanor felt her shoulders relax. Can I ask about your wife? She said finally. James's mother? Caleb was quiet for so long Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. Then, Sarah was good, kind, strong. She loved this life, loved the ranch. He paused. She died giving birth to our second child. The baby died too, a daughter. Eleanor's heart clenched. I'm so sorry. It was 3 years ago. We've learned to live with it. But James still has nightmares sometimes. Still asks questions I don't know how to answer. He looked at her. I'm not looking for someone to erase Sarah. I'm looking for someone to help us move forward. I understand. Do you? His gaze was penetrating. Because I need to know you're here for the long haul, Eleanor. I can't have James getting attached to you and then have you decide frontier life isn't for you and leave. That would destroy him. I'm not going to leave, Eleanor said firmly. I didn't come all this way to run at the first difficulty. Even if I'm harder to live with than you expected. Are you cruel? No. Do you drink to excess? No. Do you keep your promises? Yes. Then I can manage the rest. Eleanor stopped walking and faced him. I need you to understand something too, Caleb. I'm not beautiful. I'm not charming. I'm not what most men would choose. But I'm loyal, and I'm hardworking, and I don't give up easily. I came here knowing it would be hard. I'm not expecting easy. Something flickered in his eyes. Respect, maybe, or approval. All right, then. All right. They stood there for a moment, two strangers who had just agreed to bind their lives together, and Eleanor felt the weight of it settle over her like a blanket, comforting and suffocating at once. We should head back, Caleb said. James will want to show you the horses before supper. He's been planning it all week. As they walked back toward the house, Eleanor noticed details she'd missed before. The care taken with the fences, the neat rows of the garden, the way everything had its place and purpose. This was a life built deliberately, carefully. A life that made sense. Maybe she could fit into it after all. That evening, after a supper of stew and bread, James dragged Eleanor out to the barn to meet the horses. Caleb followed at a distance, leaning against the fence and watching as his son enthusiastically introduced each animal. This is Blaze. She's mine. Well, sort of. Pa says I can really have her when I'm 10. And this is Buttercup. She's gentle. You could ride her. And that's Thunder. He's Pa's horse. Don't go near him unless Pa's with you because he doesn't like strangers. Eleanor listened patiently, asking questions, letting James's enthusiasm wash over her. The boy was transformed when he talked about the horses. Animated, joyful, completely unself-conscious. This was who he was when he felt safe. Later, after James had been sent to bed with promises of the dragon story tomorrow, Eleanor sat on the porch with Caleb. The night was cool, stars beginning to emerge in the vast sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. "He likes you," Caleb said quietly. "I like him too. He's a good boy." "He is." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for being patient with him." "It's not patience, it's genuine interest." Eleanor looked at the stars. "I meant what I said, Caleb. I want to be here. I want to help." "Then we'll make this work," he said simply. And sitting there in the Wyoming darkness, listening to the night sounds of her new home, Eleanor believed him. Day after tomorrow, she would marry this steady, honest man. She would become a wife and stepmother. She would begin a life that had started as a cruel joke, but had become something real. Something hers. She was ready. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold, the kind of autumn day that promised winter wasn't far behind. Eleanor woke in her small room to the sound of voices downstairs, Mrs. Kowalski directing James about something, the clatter of dishes being set out for breakfast. For a moment she lay still, letting the reality wash over her. Today. She was getting married today, to a man she'd known for less than 48 hours. Her stomach twisted with nerves, but underneath that was something steadier, a sense of rightness she couldn't quite explain. This was what she'd chosen. This was her escape, her opportunity, her future. Whatever came next, it was hers to shape. She dressed carefully in the one good dress she owned that wasn't gray, a deep blue wool that brought out what little color there was in her eyes. Her mother had insisted she pack it, though Eleanor suspected it was less out of maternal concern and more from fear that Eleanor would embarrass the family by showing up to her own wedding looking like a governess. When she came downstairs, Mrs. Kowalski looked her over with that same assessing gaze, then gave a short nod. "You'll do. Coffee's hot, and there's Johnny cakes if you can stomach eating." Eleanor couldn't, really, but she forced down half a Johnny cake to be polite. James appeared at her elbow, already dressed in what was clearly his Sunday best, clean trousers, a white shirt, suspenders that looked newly purchased. "You look pretty, Miss Eleanor," he said seriously. "Thank you, James. You look very handsome." He flushed with pleasure. "Pa said I have to be on my best behavior at the wedding. He said it's an important day." "It is," Eleanor agreed, her heart squeezing. "Very important." Caleb came in from the barn, brushing hay from his shoulders. He'd clearly been working already. The cattle didn't care about weddings, but he'd cleaned up as much as possible. When he saw Eleanor, he stopped mid-step, and something flickered across his face too quickly for her to read. "You ready?" he asked. Such a simple question, such a loaded one. "Yes," Eleanor said, and meant it. The ceremony was to be held at the schoolhouse, Reverend Thompson having arrived the night before and stayed with the Morrisons, the family who owned the ranch to the east. They would ride into town together, Caleb, Eleanor, James, and Mrs. Kowalski, who had agreed to stand as witness. The ride took nearly an hour, the wagon bouncing over rutted roads that wound through increasingly populated country. Eleanor saw more ranches, more cattle, signs of human habitation growing denser as they approached what Caleb had called town. Town turned out to be a generous description. There were perhaps 30 buildings clustered along a single main street, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a boarding house, the schoolhouse, and various other structures in varying states of completion or decay. But there was a church bell mounted on a post outside the schoolhouse, and someone had hung bunting for the occasion. Several wagons were already there. Word had gotten around, apparently. "You didn't tell me there would be other people," Eleanor said, her nerves ratcheting up another notch. "Didn't know for sure," Caleb replied. "But folks are curious. New people are news out here, and a wedding's an event." He glanced at her. "You don't have to talk to anyone if you don't want to. We can do the ceremony and leave." But Eleanor shook her head. These were her neighbors now, her community. She couldn't start her new life by hiding. As they climbed down from the wagon, people began to emerge from the schoolhouse. A weathered man in a suit that had seen better days, Reverend Thompson, Eleanor guessed, a woman about Eleanor's age with kind eyes, and a baby on her hip. An older couple, the man with a magnificent white beard, children of various ages, including a boy who looked about James's age and immediately called out a greeting. "That's Tommy," James whispered to Eleanor. "Can I go talk to him?" "After the ceremony," Caleb said firmly. "Stay close for now." A Chinese man in his 40s approached, a girl of about 10 at his side. "Mr. Ridgway," he said, his English lightly accented. "Good to see you, and this must be your bride." "Eleanor Hale," Caleb said. "Eleanor, this is Henry Chen. He runs the general store, and this is his daughter, Sarah." The girl, Sarah Chen, the one James had mentioned, looked at Eleanor with open curiosity. "Are you really from Missouri? Grandmother said you rode the train all by yourself for 6 whole days." "I did," Eleanor confirmed. "That's very brave," Sarah said solemnly. "I've never been on a train. Grandmother says the world looks different when you're moving that fast." Eleanor found herself smiling. "Your grandmother is very wise. She was kind to me during the journey." "She said you seemed like a sensible person," Henry Chen said. "From my mother, that's high praise. Welcome to our community, Miss Hale." Before Eleanor could respond, more people crowded around. The woman with the baby introduced herself as Lucy Morrison, married to Tom Morrison, who owned the Eastern Ranch. The older couple were the Hendersons, who'd been in Wyoming since before it was a territory. A weathered woman named Kate, who ran the boarding house. A young cowhand named Charlie, who blushed and stammered when Eleanor said hello. They were curious but not unkind. They looked at Eleanor with interest, not judgment. Out here, it seemed, the fact that she'd come all this way, that she'd been brave enough to answer a mail-order advertisement, earned her a certain respect. Or maybe they were just grateful for the entertainment. Reverend Thompson clapped his hands together. "Well now, shall we begin? I've got another stop to make before nightfall." The schoolhouse had been cleaned and decorated. Someone had put wildflowers in jars on the windowsills, and the children's slates had been neatly stacked. Rough wooden benches served as pews, and people filed in and found seats. Eleanor stood at the front with Caleb, James between them, and felt the weight of all those eyes on her back. Her hands were trembling, so she clasped them together tightly. Caleb noticed. Without looking at her, he shifted slightly closer, his shoulder brushing hers, a small gesture of solidarity that steadied her more than words could have. Reverend Thompson opened his worn Bible and smiled at them. He was older than Eleanor had expected, probably close to 70, with laugh lines around his eyes and the kind of face that had seen plenty of weather. "Dearly beloved," he began, and Eleanor felt the words settle over her like a benediction. "We are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The ceremony was simple, stripped of all the elaborate ritual Eleanor had witnessed at Catherine's wedding. No organ music, no elaborate vows written by the couple, no lengthy sermon about the duties of husbands and wives. Just the essential words, the binding promises. "Caleb Ridgway, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Caleb's voice was steady. "I do." "Eleanor Hale, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Eleanor's voice only shook slightly. "I do." "The ring?" Caleb pulled a simple gold band from his pocket, nothing fancy but solid and real. He took Eleanor's hand, his calluses rough against her skin, and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming and the grace of God, I now pronounce you man and wife." Reverend Thompson beamed at them. "You may kiss your bride, son." Eleanor's breath caught. They hadn't discussed this part. Caleb looked at her, a question in his eyes. She gave the tiniest nod, and he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. Brief, chaste, almost formal. It was over in seconds, but Eleanor felt it like a brand. She was married. The small congregation erupted in applause. James tugged on Eleanor's sleeve. Does this mean I can call you Ma now? Eleanor's throat tightened. If you want to, or you can call me Eleanor, whatever feels right to you. James considered this seriously. Can I try both and see which one fits better? That sounds perfect. Lucy Morrison had organized a small reception. Nothing elaborate, just punch and cookies that the women of the community had contributed. People crowded around to offer congratulations, to ask Eleanor questions about Missouri, to share advice about surviving Wyoming winters. Get good wool stockings, Kate from the boarding house advised, the kind that come up past your knees, and learn to make a proper stew that can simmer all day. You'll be grateful for it come January. Don't let the hands walk all over you, Lucy Morrison added, bouncing her baby on her hip. They'll test you at first, see if you're really the mistress of the house or just window dressing. Stand your ground. Henry Chen pressed a small package into her hands. A wedding gift. Tea from my mother's hometown. She says it helps with homesickness. Eleanor found herself blinking back tears. These people didn't know her, but they were welcoming her anyway, offering kindness and practical help in equal measure. Caleb stayed close, not hovering, but present, ready to intervene if anyone got too personal with their questions. But mostly, he let Eleanor handle it, watching as she navigated these first social interactions in her new home. You're doing fine, he murmured when there was a brief lull. Better than fine. They're kind, Eleanor said. They're curious. But yes, they're kind too. Mostly. He nodded toward an older woman standing apart from the group, watching the proceedings with a sour expression. That's Prudence Hartwell, owns a small spread south of town. She's difficult. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Prudence Hartwell approached. She was perhaps 60, dressed in black despite it not being a funeral, with the kind of pinched face that suggested she found the entire world disappointing. So you're the mail-order bride, she said without preamble. Come all the way from Missouri to marry a man you'd never met. How very modern. The word modern was clearly an insult. Eleanor lifted her chin. How very practical, actually. Mr. Ridgway needed a wife. I needed a new beginning. We've made an arrangement that suits us both. An arrangement, Mrs. Hartwell sniffed. Marriage should be based on love and Christian values, not arrangements. I believe partnership and mutual respect are quite Christian values, Eleanor replied evenly. And love, if it comes, will be built on that foundation. Caleb's hand found the small of Eleanor's back, a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by Mrs. Hartwell or anyone else watching. Well, the older woman said tightly, I suppose we'll see how long you last. Wyoming has a way of separating the wheat from the chaff. Most Eastern women don't make it through their first winter. Then I suppose I'll have to prove myself wheat, Eleanor said. Mrs. Hartwell swept away, and Lucy Morrison appeared at Eleanor's elbow. Don't mind Prudence. She's been bitter since her husband died and her son moved to California. She can't stand seeing other people happy. I'll remember that, Eleanor said. The reception wound down as the afternoon wore on. People began making their excuses, heading home to evening chores and responsibilities. James had long since run off with Tommy Morrison and Sarah Chen, the three of them playing some elaborate game involving a stick and a great deal of running. Finally, as the sun began to dip toward the western mountains, Caleb touched Eleanor's arm. We should head back. Still got animals to feed. The ride home was quieter. James, worn out from playing, dozed against Eleanor's shoulder. Mrs. Kowalski sat in the back of the wagon, humming tunelessly. Caleb drove with his usual steady competence, his face unreadable in the fading light. Eleanor twisted the ring on her finger, feeling its unfamiliar weight. She was married. She was Eleanor Ridgway now, not Eleanor Hale. The plain daughter from Missouri was gone. In her place was a rancher's wife, a stepmother, a woman with purpose. The reality of it should have terrified her. Instead, she felt oddly calm. When they reached the ranch, Caleb helped her down from the wagon with careful formality. I'll see to the horses. Mrs. Kowalski, can you help Eleanor get James to bed? Of course. The housekeeper gently shook James awake. Come on, boy. Time for sleep. James stirred, blinking sleepily. But the dragon story. Eleanor promised. Tomorrow, Eleanor said gently. You're too tired tonight. Promise? I promise. He let himself be led away, and Eleanor found herself alone in the main room of the house. Her house now. She walked slowly through the space, seeing it with new eyes. The stone fireplace where a low fire burned. The simple furniture, well made but worn. The kitchen area, clean and functional. The stairs leading up to the bedrooms, to her bedroom, and Caleb's. She thought about what Caleb had said, that he wouldn't force anything on her, that her room was her own until she decided otherwise. The relief of that warred with an unexpected curiosity. What would it be like to share a bed with this solid, honest man? Would it be terrible, as her mother had grimly suggested all marital relations were? Or could it be something else? But not tonight. Tonight she was too tired, too overwhelmed, too aware that they were still strangers despite the ring on her finger. Caleb came in from the barn, brushing dust from his sleeves. He looked at her standing in the middle of the room and seemed to understand her thoughts. Long day, he said simply. Very long. You handled it well. The people. The questions. Even Prudence Hartwell. Eleanor almost smiled. Was I supposed to handle her differently? No. You handled her perfectly. He moved to the fireplace, adding another log. I know this isn't what most women would consider a proper wedding day. No fancy dress, no big celebration. It was enough, Eleanor said honestly. It was real. He straightened, turning to face her. I meant what I said in my vows. I'll be a good husband to you, Eleanor. Maybe not the husband other men are, but I'll keep my word. I know you will. They stood there in the firelight, two people who had just bound their lives together, and Eleanor felt the weight of all the choices that had led to this moment. Her sister's cruel joke, the letters exchanged, the train journey, the decision to say yes, every single choice that had brought her here, to this house, to this man, to this new life. Good night, Caleb, she said softly. Good night, Eleanor. She climbed the stairs to her room and changed into her nightgown, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. Caleb's footsteps in his own room, Mrs. Kowalski moving around in the cabin out back, the wind picking up outside, whistling around the eaves. She lay in bed, looking at the ring on her finger catching the moonlight, and let herself acknowledge the truth. She had no idea if this would work, if she could be the wife and mother this household needed, if she could survive the isolation and the hard work and the brutal winters everyone kept warning her about. But for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she'd chosen to be. Not invisible in a corner, not overlooked and forgotten, not the plain daughter, the burden, the joke. She was Eleanor Ridgway, and she mattered here. That would have to be enough to start. Sleep came surprisingly easily, and with it, dreams of wide skies and possibilities. The morning after the wedding, Eleanor woke to unfamiliar sounds, cattle lowing in the distance, the creak of the windmill, boots on the porch below her window. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the ring caught her eye, and everything came flooding back. She dressed quickly in one of her simpler dresses and went downstairs. Mrs. Kowalski was already in the kitchen, mixing something in a large bowl. Morning, the older woman said without looking up. Sleep well? Yes, actually. Good. You'll need your rest. Real work starts today. Mrs. Kowalski gestured to the stove. Coffee's hot. Biscuits will be ready in 10 minutes. The men eat at 6, so you'll need to be up by 5 most mornings to have breakfast ready. Eleanor absorbed this information. 5 in the morning, every morning. What about James? He gets himself up for school days. Saturdays he sleeps late, but Sunday he has to be ready for church when the Reverend's in town, Mrs. Kowalski pulled the biscuits from the oven and started arranging them on a platter. There's 4 ranch hands right now. They eat breakfast and supper here in the main house. Lunch they make themselves from whatever's in the smokehouse. They're good men mostly, but they'll test you. Want to see if you're worth respecting. How do I earn their respect? Feed them well. Don't waste food, don't put on airs, and for God's sake, don't flirt. Mrs. Kowalski finally looked at her. You don't seem the type, but I'll say it anyway. These men spend months at a time with no female company except me, and I'm too old and mean to be interesting. A young wife in the house, Well, keep it professional. I understand. The door opened and Caleb came in with 3 men behind him. Eleanor recognized the youngest one, Charlie, who'd blushed at the wedding. The other 2 were older, weathered men with the lean, tough look of people who worked outdoors in all seasons. Eleanor, Caleb said, these are the hands. Charlie you met. That's Bill Thompson, no relation to the Reverend, and Sam Peters. Bill Thompson was probably 50, with gray in his beard and eyes that had seen everything. He touched his hat brim. Ma'am. Sam Peters was younger, maybe 30, with a scar running down one cheek and an expression that suggested he didn't trust easily. He gave Eleanor a long, measuring look before nodding. Mrs. Ridgway. They settled at the table and Mrs. Kowalski began serving breakfast with practiced efficiency. Eleanor jumped in to help, earning an approving nod from the housekeeper. The men ate in near silence, shoveling food with the focus of people who had hard work ahead and limited time. Eleanor noticed details. The way Caleb automatically gave the largest biscuit to Sam, who was the biggest of the group. The way Charlie kept sneaking glances at her when he thought she wasn't looking. The way Bill Thompson assessed everything with those sharp eyes. We're moving the herd to the south pasture today, Caleb said. Should take most of the morning. Eleanor, Mrs. Kowalski will show you around, get you familiar with how things run. It wasn't a question, but Eleanor nodded anyway. Of course. After the men left, Mrs. Kowalski surveyed Eleanor critically. Can you really cook, or were you just saying that to get the job? I can cook, Eleanor said. My mother believed all her daughters should know domestic skills, even if we had servants to do the actual work. Servants? Mrs. Kowalski snorted. Well, you don't have servants here. You have me for another week, and then you're on your own. Eleanor's stomach dropped. Another week? But I thought, I'm retiring, girl. I told Caleb months ago when he started talking about finding a wife. I've been keeping this house for 3 years since Sarah died, and I'm tired. I've got a daughter in Denver who's been begging me to come live with her. Soon as you're settled, I'm gone. The floor seemed to tilt under Eleanor's feet. 1 week. She had 1 week to learn how to run this entire household. Don't look so terrified, Mrs. Kowalski said, but her tone was slightly softer. It's not as complicated as you think. This time of year, it's mostly about keeping everyone fed and warm. Come spring, there's the garden and the chickens and the preserving, but you've got months before you need to worry about that. She spent the next several hours walking Eleanor through the house and explaining the systems Sarah Ridgway had established. The root cellar, stocked with potatoes and turnips and carrots. The smokehouse, with hanging beef and pork. The pantry, with its neat rows of preserved vegetables and fruits. The linen closet. The cleaning supplies. The schedule for laundry. Mondays are wash days, Mrs. Kowalski explained. You heat water in the big kettle, use the washboard and lye soap. Hang everything to dry, weather permitting. Tuesdays are for ironing. Wednesdays you clean the bedrooms upstairs. Thursdays the downstairs. Fridays you bake bread for the week. Saturdays you do mending and whatever else needs doing. Sundays, if there's church, you go. If there's not, you rest. Eleanor's head was spinning, but she took notes in a small journal she'd brought from Missouri. Mrs. Kowalski seemed pleased by this. You're practical, the older woman said. That's good. Sarah was practical too. She'd have liked you, I think. It was the first time Mrs. Kowalski had mentioned Caleb's first wife with any warmth, and Eleanor seized the opportunity. What was she like? Mrs. Kowalski was quiet for a moment, her hands stilling over the linens she was folding. Strong. Not physically, necessarily, though she could work as hard as any man when needed, but strong here, she tapped her chest. She knew who she was. She loved Caleb and James fiercely, loved this ranch. When she died, the older woman shook her head. It nearly broke Caleb. Would have, if not for James needing him. How long were they married? 5 years. They met in Denver. She was working in her father's hotel, and Caleb was there selling cattle. He courted her for 6 months before convincing her to give up city life for ranching. Mrs. Kowalski smiled slightly. She said she knew within a week she'd marry him, but she made him work for it anyway. Said if he wasn't persistent enough to court her properly, he wouldn't be persistent enough to make a marriage work. Eleanor absorbed this, feeling the ghost of Sarah Ridgway all around her. This was Sarah's kitchen, Sarah's pantry, Sarah's systems and routines. These were Sarah's dishes and Sarah's linens and Sarah's home. How could Eleanor possibly fill those shoes? "Don't," Mrs. Kowalski said sharply, as if reading her thoughts. "Don't try to be her. She's gone. You're here. Caleb knows the difference, and so should you." "But James? James knows the difference too. He was only 4 when Sarah died, but he remembers her. Trying to replace her would be an insult to both of them." Mrs. Kowalski met Eleanor's eyes. "Be yourself. Be the wife and mother they need now, not the one they lost. That's all anyone can ask." Before Eleanor could respond, the door burst open and James tumbled in, followed by Caleb and the hands. It was noon already, time for the midday meal. "We'll make sandwiches," Mrs. Kowalski said. "Quick and simple. Eleanor, slice that bread while I get the meat from the smokehouse." Eleanor worked alongside the housekeeper, assembling sandwiches and pouring coffee while the men washed up at the pump outside. It was simple work, but there was a rhythm to it, a satisfaction in feeding hungry people and watching them eat. Caleb caught her eye across the room and gave her a small nod. Approval? Encouragement? Eleanor wasn't sure, but it warmed her anyway. That afternoon, while Mrs. Kowalski napped and the men were back working the herd, Eleanor took James outside. He'd come home from school excited and chattering about something Tommy Morrison had done, and she'd promised to listen properly. They sat on the porch steps, and James launched into an elaborate story involving Tommy, a frog, and Miss Patterson's water bucket. Eleanor listened, asked questions, and laughed in the right places. When the story wound down, James looked at her seriously. "Do you think you'll like it here?" "I think I already do," Eleanor said honestly. "Even though it's not fancy like Missouri?" "Missouri wasn't fancy for me, James. I wasn't happy there." "Why not? How did you explain to a 7-year-old about being invisible? About sisters who were beautiful and parents who were indifferent and a life that felt like waiting for nothing?" "Sometimes," Eleanor said carefully, "people don't see us the way we really are. They see what they expect to see or what they want to see. In Missouri, people saw me one way. Here, I get to be someone different." James considered this. "Pa sees you." "What do you mean?" "He watches you sometimes. When you're not looking, like he's trying to figure something out." James swung his legs. "He used to look at Ma like that too, before she got sick, like she was a puzzle he wanted to solve." Eleanor's heart did something complicated in her chest. "What do you see when you look at me?" James tilted his head, studying her with that serious expression. "Someone who listens. Someone who doesn't mind questions. Someone who might stay." The last part was said so quietly, Eleanor almost missed it. But she heard it, heard the fear underneath. She put her arm around his thin shoulders. "I'm staying, James. I promise." "People promise things and then they go away anyway," he said. "Ma promised she'd be fine, and then she wasn't." Eleanor had no answer for that. He was right. Promises couldn't protect against death or tragedy or all the things that could tear a family apart. But she could give him what she had. "You're right," she said. "Sometimes promises aren't enough. But I can tell you this. I don't want to go anywhere else. This is where I want to be. And I'll be here as long as I possibly can." James leaned against her, and they sat in silence watching the sun move across the sky. In the distance, Eleanor could see the men working the cattle, small figures against the vast landscape. Closer, chickens scratched in their yard. The wind carried the smell of sage and grass and livestock. It wasn't beautiful in the way Missouri had been beautiful. There were no manicured gardens, no elegant houses, no society to impress. But there was something here, something real and solid and true. "Will you tell me the dragon story tonight?" James asked. "Absolutely," Eleanor promised. That evening, after supper had been served and the dishes cleared, Eleanor sat on James's bed and opened one of the books she'd brought from Missouri. It was a collection of fairy tales and fables worn from years of reading. "This story is about a dragon named Ember," she began, and James settled in, his eyes already growing heavy. "He was born in the highest mountains, where dragons are supposed to love flying among the clouds. But Ember had a secret. Heights made him dizzy and afraid." She read slowly, adding voices for the different characters. watching James's face as he followed the story. Caleb appeared in the doorway at some point, leaning against the frame and listening quietly. By the time Ember finally overcame his fear to save his friend, James was asleep. Eleanor marked the page and set the book aside, then carefully pulled the blankets up over the boy. "You're good with him," Caleb said softly. "He's easy to be good with." Eleanor stood, suddenly aware of how domestic this scene was. Her tucking in his son, the two of them in the doorway like any married couple. They went downstairs together. Mrs. Kowalski had already retired to her cabin. The house was quiet except for the crackling fire and the wind outside. "I want to thank you," Caleb said, pouring himself a small measure of whiskey from a bottle on the shelf. "For today. For trying." "I'm not trying," Eleanor said. "I'm just being here. That's all James needs. Consistency. Someone who doesn't leave." Eleanor thought about what James had said on the porch. "He told me his mother promised she'd be fine." Caleb's hand tightened on his glass. "She did. She promised both of us. She was so certain." He stopped, swallowed. "The midwife said sometimes it just happens. Nothing anyone could have done. But Sarah kept saying she was fine, right up until she wasn't, and then it was too late." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said quietly. 3 years, and it's still—" He shook his head. "James is terrified of losing people now, anyone who matters to him. That's why he was so hesitant when I told him I was looking for a wife. Took weeks to convince him it might be a good thing." "What convinced him?" "I told him you knew stories." Caleb almost smiled. He said anyone who knows good stories probably has enough interesting things in their head to stick around. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "That's a very James way of thinking." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, the fire warming the room. Eleanor found herself studying Caleb, the lines around his eyes, the calluses on his hands, the solid way he occupied space. He wasn't handsome, but there was something appealing about his steadiness, his reliability. "I should let you rest," Caleb said finally. "Tomorrow Mrs. Kowalski starts teaching you the accounts. Fair warning, she's particular about how the books are kept." "I'll do my best." At the bottom of the stairs, Caleb stopped. "Eleanor, you did well today. At the wedding, with the people, with James, with all of it." "Thank you. I know this isn't— I know I'm not—" He struggled for words. "I'm grateful you're here, that you took a chance on this." Eleanor looked at him, this man who was now her husband, who was trying so hard to make this strange arrangement work. "I'm grateful too. You gave me something I never had before." "What's that?" "A choice about my own life." Something shifted in his expression, understanding maybe, or recognition. He reached out and briefly squeezed her hand. "Good night, Eleanor." "Good night, Caleb." She climbed the stairs to her room, her hand still warm from his touch, and lay in bed thinking about the day. Her wedding day. Not the romantic fantasy she'd read about in books, but something better in its own way, something honest and real and built on mutual need rather than illusion. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the dark prairie. Inside, the house creaked and settled. And Eleanor, the plain daughter from Missouri, the mail-order bride, the woman who had come west as a joke, closed her eyes and felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. Not love, not yet, but possibility. And that was enough. The week passed in a blur of learning and adaptation. Mrs. Kowalski proved to be a demanding but thorough teacher, drilling Eleanor on everything from the proper way to render lard to the exact temperature needed for baking bread at high altitude. Eleanor's hands, soft from years of ornamental needlework, developed blisters that became calluses. Her back ached from hauling water and scrubbing floors. But she learned. On the 8th day, Mrs. Kowalski packed her belongings into a small trunk and stood in the kitchen, surveying her domain one last time. "The accounts are balanced through last week," she said, her tone brisk to hide the emotion underneath. "I've left notes on the preserves, which ones to use first, which we'll keep through winter. The chimney needs cleaning before the real cold hits, but Bill Thompson knows how. Don't let him put it off." "I won't," Eleanor promised. "And James," Mrs. Kowalski's voice softened. He's a good boy, but he has nightmares sometimes. Sarah used to sit with him until he fell back asleep. Don't try to talk him out of being scared. Just be there. I will. The older woman studied Eleanor for a long moment. You'll do fine. You're tougher than you look. I don't feel tough. Nobody does at first. But you came all the way from Missouri on your own. You married a stranger. You're still standing. That's tough enough. Mrs. Kowalski held out her hand and Eleanor shook it. Write to me if you need advice. My daughter's address is in the book by the stove. Then she was gone, Caleb driving her into town to catch the stage to Denver, and Eleanor was alone in the house for the first time since arriving. She stood in the kitchen, listening to the silence. This was her domain now, her responsibility. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt a strange sense of rightness. This was what she'd come for, to be needed, to be essential, to matter. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. That first week alone taught Eleanor more about herself than 23 years in Missouri ever had. She learned she could wake at 5 in the morning and have breakfast ready by 6. She learned she could manage accounts and inventory with the same precision she'd once applied to needlework. She learned she could kill a chicken without fainting, even if she did apologize to the bird first. The ranch hands tested her, just as Mrs. Kowalski had predicted. Sam Peters asked for his eggs cooked 3 different ways in 3 days, clearly trying to see if she'd accommodate or push back. Eleanor cooked the eggs exactly as requested each time, but on the 4th day she served everyone's eggs the same way and said pleasantly, "This is what's on offer today. Take it or make your own." Sam had grinned and eaten without complaint. Bill Thompson made a comment about the biscuits being too dense, comparing them unfavorably to Mrs. Kowalski's. Eleanor had simply said, "Then I'll work on making them better. In the meantime, you're welcome to teach me your preferred method." Bill had looked surprised, then grudgingly approving. "My ma used to add a bit more buttermilk, kept them lighter." "I'll try that tomorrow, thank you." Even Charlie, sweet Charlie, who'd been nothing but polite, tested her boundaries by tracking mud across her freshly scrubbed floor. Eleanor had handed him a mop without a word. He'd cleaned it up, shamefaced, and never did it again. But it was with James that Eleanor found her true purpose. The boy had been reserved at first, watching her with cautious eyes, clearly expecting her to leave or disappoint him somehow. But Eleanor showed up every day. She made his breakfast, packed his lunch for school, listened to his stories about Tommy Morrison and Sarah Chen and Miss Patterson. She read to him every night, working their way through her entire collection of books. Slowly, James began to relax. He started seeking her out when he had a question. He showed her his schoolwork without prompting. He laughed more easily. 3 weeks after Mrs. Kowalski left, James came running in from school with tears streaming down his face. Eleanor was in the kitchen kneading bread, and she immediately wiped her hands and knelt down. "What happened?" "Tommy said," James hiccuped. "He said you're not my real ma, and you'll probably leave just like she did, and I'm stupid for pretending you won't." Eleanor's heart clenched. She pulled James into her arms, feeling his small body shake with sobs. "Listen to me. Tommy Morrison is a good friend, but he doesn't know everything. You're not stupid, and I'm not leaving." "You can't promise that." Ma promised, and she left anyway. "You're right. I can't promise I'll never die, because nobody can promise that. But I can promise I'm not going anywhere on purpose. I'm not leaving because I want to. This is my home now. You're my family now." She pulled back to look at him. "And you're right that I'm not your real mother. But I'd like to be your real something. Your friend, maybe. Your Eleanor. Whatever you need me to be." James wiped his nose on his sleeve. "What if I need you to be my ma? Not the same as my old ma, but my now ma." Eleanor felt tears prick her own eyes. "Then I'd be honored to be that." James threw his arms around her neck and held on tight. Over his head, Eleanor saw Caleb standing in the doorway, having come in from the barn without her noticing. The look on his face was complicated, grief and gratitude and something else she couldn't quite name. That night, after James had cried himself to sleep and Eleanor had sat with him just as Mrs. Kowalski had instructed, she came downstairs to find Caleb waiting. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for what you said to him, about being his now ma. I meant it. I know you did. That's why it mattered." Caleb poured 2 glasses of whiskey, handing one to Eleanor. She'd never had whiskey before, but she took it without comment. He's been holding back, trying not to get attached. I could see it, but I didn't know how to fix it. He's protecting himself, Eleanor said. It makes sense after what he's been through. They sat by the fire, sipping whiskey that burned Eleanor's throat and warmed her stomach. Outside, winter was announcing itself with increasing insistence. The nights were cold enough now that frost covered everything by morning, and the hands had started talking about when the first snow would come. I need to ask something of you, Caleb said. Winter here is hard. Not just the weather, the isolation. We could go weeks without seeing anyone outside this ranch. The hands get restless. James gets cabin fever. It's easy to feel trapped. I understand. Do you? His eyes were serious. Because I need you to understand before you commit. If it gets to be too much, if you want to leave, you tell me before spring. Not after the thaw when I'm depending on you for calving season. I need to know you're in this. Eleanor set down her glass. I'm in this, Caleb. I'm not going back to Missouri. There's nothing for me there. That's not a good enough reason to stay. Then how about this? I want to be here. I like the work. I like feeling useful. I like James, and I'm starting to like you. I like the person I'm becoming in this place. She met his gaze steadily. Is that good enough? Something shifted in his expression. Yeah, that's good enough. November brought the first real snow. Eleanor woke one morning to find the world transformed, white everywhere, covering the familiar landscape in soft, silent beauty. James was ecstatic, dragging her outside to build a snowman before school. Even the hands seemed lighter, throwing snowballs and acting half their age. But the snow also meant harder work. Water had to be hauled and heated for everything. The animals needed extra feed and care. Paths had to be kept clear between the house and the barn and the bunkhouse. Eleanor learned to wrap herself in layers of wool and push through the biting cold to do what needed doing. She also learned the value of community. Lucy Morrison came to visit one afternoon, bringing her baby and a basket of apples from their root cellar. Thought you might like these, Lucy said, stamping snow off her boots. And I wanted to check on you. First winter can be rough. They sat in the kitchen drinking tea while the baby napped in a basket, and Lucy shared the hard-won wisdom of 5 Wyoming winters. Keep busy, she advised. That's the key. Don't sit around dwelling on how cold and dark it is. Find projects. I taught myself to knit my first winter. Nearly went mad with boredom otherwise. What else should I know? Lucy considered. Stock up on reading material, coffee and flour and sugar. Make sure you have plenty. Get creative with meals because fresh food is scarce. And most importantly, don't let cabin fever make you mean. It's easy to take frustrations out on the people closest to you when you're trapped together for months. Eleanor thought about that after Lucy left. She could already feel the isolation creeping in. The way days blurred together, the way the walls seemed to press closer. But she took Lucy's advice and found projects. She reorganized the pantry. She started teaching James more advanced arithmetic in the evenings. She began mending and altering some of Sarah's old dresses that Caleb had kept in a trunk, making them fit her own frame. That last project felt strange at first, wearing a dead woman's clothes. But they were good dresses, practical and well-made, and it seemed wasteful to let them sit unused. The first time she came down to breakfast in one of Sarah's altered house dresses, Caleb stopped mid-step. He cleared his throat. That was Sarah's. I hope you don't mind. Mrs. Kowalski mentioned the trunk, and I thought, no, it's fine. It's good. She'd want them used, not gathering dust. But something in his face suggested this was harder than he was letting on. That evening, Eleanor brought it up. If it bothers you, me wearing Sarah's things, I can stick to my own dresses. Caleb was mending a bridle, his hands steady despite the difficult conversation. It doesn't bother me, not the way you think. It's just strange. Seeing her clothes on someone else. Moving on feels like betrayal sometimes. You're not betraying her by living your life. I know that. In my head, I know that. He set down the bridle. But my heart takes longer to catch up. Eleanor understood that. She'd seen the way he sometimes got a distant look when she did something in the kitchen, as if remembering how Sarah used to do it. The way he'd pause at the door to James's room when Eleanor was reading bedtime stories, listening to her voice instead of the one he wished was there. "Take the time you need," Eleanor said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." December arrived with deeper cold and shorter days. The ranch settled into winter rhythms. Animals fed and watered, paths kept clear, the household maintained in comfortable routine. Eleanor had found her place in it all. She wasn't Sarah, and she'd stopped trying to be. She was Eleanor, and that was enough. Then came the day Sam Peters showed up at the kitchen door with blood seeping through his shirt. "It's nothing," he insisted, even as Eleanor pulled him inside. "Just caught myself on barbed wire fixing the fence in the north pasture." "Sit down before you fall down," Eleanor ordered, already heating water. "Caleb, get the medical kit." She'd never tended a wound this serious before, but she'd watched her mother's cook deal with various kitchen injuries, and Mrs. Kowalski had left detailed notes on basic medical care. She cleaned the gash, a nasty tear across Sam's ribs, and stitched it with the same steady hand she'd once used for embroidery. Sam gritted his teeth but didn't complain. When she finished and bandaged him properly, he looked at her with new respect. "You've got a steady hand, Mrs. Ridgway." "Had plenty of practice with needlework. Turns out skin isn't that different from fabric." She washed her hands, trying to hide how much they were shaking now that it was over. "Keep it clean and dry. Come back in 3 days so I can check it." After Sam left, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table and let herself shake. Caleb poured her whiskey without asking. "You did good," he said. "I thought I was going to be sick." "But you weren't. You did what needed doing." He sat across from her. "That's what this life is, Eleanor. Doing what needs doing, even when it's hard." She looked at him. This man who'd become her husband, her partner in this strange life they were building. "Does it get easier?" "Some things do. Some things don't. But you get stronger." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "You're already stronger than you were when you arrived." His hand was warm and calloused and steady. Eleanor found herself not wanting him to move it. He didn't, not for a long moment. They sat there in the lamplight, connected by that simple touch, and Eleanor felt something shift between them. Not love, not yet, but the foundation that love might grow from. Christmas came quietly. Eleanor made special meals and helped James string popcorn for the small pine tree Caleb cut and brought inside. On Christmas morning, she woke to find a package on her doorstep, a new wool shawl, soft and warm, in a deep green that actually flattered her coloring. "Caleb helped me pick it," James announced proudly. "We went to Mr. Chen's store and looked at all the colors. Pa said green would look nice on you." Eleanor wrapped herself in it and found Caleb watching from the kitchen. "Thank you," she said. "It's beautiful." "You needed something warmer than what you brought from Missouri," he said gruffly. Practical, but his eyes suggested it was more than practical. Eleanor had gifts for them, too. A new pocket knife for Caleb, carefully chosen from the general store on one of her rare trips to town. For James, she'd made a pillowcase embroidered with dragons, using skills she'd thought would never be useful for anything. James clutched it like treasure. "I'm going to use it every night. Forever." That evening, after James was asleep and the house was quiet, Eleanor and Caleb sat by the fire. Snow fell outside, soft and steady, blanketing the world in white silence. "This is nice," Eleanor said softly. "Peaceful. Different from Missouri Christmases?" "Completely. My family always made it such a production. Parties and presents and showing off for people we didn't even like." She smiled. "This is better. Even without the fancy dresses and social events? Especially without those things." She looked at him. "I don't miss that life, Caleb. I know you worry that I will, but I don't." "What do you miss?" Eleanor considered. "My sister Margaret, sometimes. She was kinder than the others. And books. I miss having access to more books. But that's all. Henry Chen can order books from Denver. Takes a few months, but he can do it." "Really?" "Really. Make a list. Consider it a late Christmas present." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the eaves. It would be a cold night, but inside was warm and safe. "Eleanor," Caleb said quietly, I want you to know this is working, this partnership, better than I expected. For me, too. I'm grateful you took a chance on this, on us. Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, saw the man beneath the rough exterior, the devoted father, the honest rancher, the widower who was slowly letting himself heal. I'm grateful you gave me the chance, she said. Something passed between them then, something unspoken but understood. They were becoming a team, not lovers, not yet, but partners in the truest sense, building something together, day by day, choice by choice. January brought the worst weather Eleanor had ever experienced, blizzards that lasted for days, cold so intense it hurt to breathe. The ranch hands moved into the bunkhouse and stayed there except for essential chores. James's school closed until spring. The four of them, Eleanor, Caleb, James, and whichever hand drew the short straw for house duty each day, were trapped together in the warm cocoon of the ranch house. Eleanor understood now what Lucy Morrison had meant about cabin fever. The walls pressed in. The sameness of each day wore at her nerves. She found herself snapping at James over nothing, then feeling guilty. But she also found unexpected moments of grace. Teaching James to play chess with a set Bill Thompson carved from scrap wood, reading aloud to everyone in the evenings, even the hands, who'd initially been skeptical but now requested specific stories. Cooking experiments that sometimes failed spectacularly but made everyone laugh. And quiet moments with Caleb, sitting by the fire after James was asleep, talking about nothing and everything. His childhood on this ranch, her years of feeling invisible, his dreams for expanding the herd, her tentative hopes for the future. One night, during a particularly fierce blizzard, the conversation turned personal. "What made you say yes?" Caleb asked. "Really? Not the practical reasons. What made you willing to marry a stranger?" Eleanor considered lying, giving him a comfortable answer. But they'd built this partnership on honesty. "I was drowning," she said simply. "In Missouri, in that life, I was drowning. Your letter was a lifeline. Maybe it would pull me somewhere worse, but at least I'd be moving. At least I'd be trying. And now? Now I'm swimming. Not drowning, maybe not gracefully, but I'm keeping my head above water." Caleb smiled slightly. "That's all any of us can do out here. Keep swimming." February brought a brief thaw, and with it, trouble. Sam Peters, restless from weeks of confinement, rode into town despite the questionable roads and came back drunk. Not falling down drunk, but mean drunk. He said something crude at the supper table, something about Eleanor that made Caleb go very still. "Apologize," Caleb said, his voice quiet and dangerous. "It was just a joke. Apologize to my wife. Now." Sam, even drunk, recognized the line he'd crossed. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Ridgway. That was out of line." Eleanor nodded, her face burning. Apology accepted. After supper, she heard raised voices outside, Caleb and Sam by the bunkhouse. She couldn't make out words, but the tone was clear. The next morning, Sam's belongings were packed and he was gone, riding toward town with his final pay in his pocket. "You didn't have to fire him," Eleanor said when Caleb came in for breakfast. "Yes, I did. I won't have anyone disrespecting you under this roof. You're my wife. You deserve to be treated as such." His jaw was set, his eyes hard. He crossed a line. There are consequences. Eleanor felt something warm unfold in her chest. Not love, not quite, but something close. Caleb had defended her, protected her, chosen her dignity over a good ranch hand. "Thank you," she said softly. His expression gentled. "You don't thank me for basic decency, remember?" But this felt like more than basic decency. This felt like partnership deepening into something else. March arrived with mud and melting snow and the first hints of spring. The world opened up again, and with it came renewed energy. James returned to school. The remaining hands began preparing for calving season. Eleanor started planning the garden. And she and Caleb continued building their life together, brick by brick, choice by choice, neither quite ready to name what was growing between them, but both feeling it nonetheless. One evening, as they sat reviewing the accounts together, a task they'd fallen into doing jointly, their hands brushed over the ledger. Caleb didn't pull away. Neither did Eleanor. You've become essential, he said quietly, not looking at her, to this ranch, to James, to me. Eleanor's heart hammered. You've become important to me too. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Eleanor saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not just gratitude or respect or partnership, something deeper, something that had been growing in the quiet spaces between them all winter. Eleanor, he said, and her name in his voice sounded like a question and an answer all at once. She squeezed his hand. I know. They sat there, hands clasped, the ledger forgotten, and let the truth settle between them. This partnership was becoming something more, and neither of them was afraid of it anymore. Spring came to Wyoming with startling speed, as if the land itself had been holding its breath all winter and finally exhaled. The snow melted in rushing torrents, filling the creek until it overflowed its banks. Green appeared overnight, tentative at first, then bold and insistent. The cattle, lean from winter, began to fatten on new grass. And Eleanor, watching it all from the kitchen window as she kneaded bread, felt something inside her bloom alongside the prairie. Calving season arrived with its particular chaos. Caleb and the hands worked around the clock, checking the herd, assisting difficult births, protecting newborns from predators and weather. Eleanor found herself running the house alone for days at a time, bringing food out to the men in the fields, tending minor injuries, managing everything while Caleb managed the herd. It was exhausting. It was exhilarating. It was the first time Eleanor truly understood what partnership meant in this context. Not romantic dinners and shared leisure, but parallel devotion to a common goal. She kept the home fires burning so Caleb could keep the ranch running. They were two parts of the same machine, each essential, each dependent on the other. Late one night, 3 weeks into calving season, Caleb stumbled into the kitchen looking like he'd been dragged through a mud hole, which Eleanor realized he probably had been. Bad birth, he said shortly. Lost the calf. Nearly lost the cow. Eleanor had hot water ready. She always had hot water ready during calving season. She poured it into the basin and handed him soap without a word. He washed his hands and face, scrubbing hard, trying to wash away more than just dirt. Sometimes it doesn't matter what you do. Sometimes they just die anyway. I'm sorry, Eleanor said, because there was nothing else to say. 53 live calves so far. 1 dead. That's good odds. But his voice was hollow. Sarah used to tell me I couldn't save them all. The trying to was arrogance, thinking I could control nature. It was the first time he'd mentioned Sarah to Eleanor in weeks. The distance in his voice suggested he was somewhere else entirely, lost in memory. Eleanor moved closer, carefully, as if approaching a skittish horse. She was right, but it still hurts to lose one. Yeah. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. You would have liked her. She would have liked you too, I think. You're different. She was bold where you're steady, quick where you're thoughtful, but you're both strong, both good. Eleanor's throat tightened. Thank you for telling me that. I want you to know her, Caleb said suddenly. Not as a ghost, not as the woman whose shadow you're living in, as a real person. Sarah Ridgway, who sang off-key and couldn't bake worth a damn but could rope a calf better than most of the hands. Who loved this ranch, and our son and me, but who also had a temper and held grudges and once threw a plate at my head when I deserved it. Eleanor found herself smiling despite the tears in her eyes. She threw a plate at you? Missed, fortunately. I'd forgotten our anniversary. He almost smiled. She made me sleep in the barn for a week. What changed her mind? I built her a bench under the cottonwoods by the creek where she liked to sit in the evenings, carved our initials in it and everything. He ran a hand through his hair. It's still there. I couldn't bring myself to... I go there sometimes. To think. Eleanor absorbed this, understanding what he was offering, a window into his past, into the life he'd had before her, not shutting her out of his grief, but inviting her to understand it. Will you show me? She asked. The bench? He looked startled, then nodded slowly. Yeah, I'd like that. They went the next evening, after supper, walking through the spring twilight to the creek. The cottonwoods were leafing out, their new growth bright green against the darkening sky. And there, beneath the largest tree, sat a simple wooden bench worn smooth by weather and time. Caleb ran his hand over the carved initials, CR plus SH, and was quiet for a long moment. "I loved her," he said finally. "I need you to know that. What we had was real and good, and I'll never regret it." "I know," Eleanor said softly. "But I'm starting to feel something for you, too. Different, maybe. Built different, but real." He turned to face her. "And I don't know if that's betraying her memory or honoring it by letting myself live again." Eleanor thought about Mrs. Chen on the train, about choosing partnership every day, about building love brick by brick instead of expecting it to arrive fully formed. "I think," she said carefully, "that Sarah would want you to be happy, would want James to have a mother who's present, not competing with a ghost, would want this ranch to thrive with two people running it instead of one person drowning in grief." "How do you know what she'd want?" "Because you loved her. And people who are loved that well, that deeply, don't want the people they leave behind to stop living." Eleanor moved closer, close enough to take his hand. "I'm not trying to replace her, Caleb. I couldn't if I tried, but I'd like to be your future, even if she's always part of your past." He looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face. "When did you get so wise?" "I'm not wise. I just spent 23 years being invisible, so I learned to watch people, to understand what they weren't saying out loud." She squeezed his hand. "You're saying you care about me, that you're ready to move forward, that you're scared it means letting her go. Am I that transparent?" "Only to someone paying attention." Caleb laughed, a real laugh that transformed his whole face. Then he did something that surprised them both. He pulled Eleanor close and kissed her. Not the brief, formal kiss from their wedding day, but something deeper, something that spoke of possibility and promise, and the slow burn of affection grown from respect. When they pulled apart, Eleanor was breathless. "Oh." "Yeah," Caleb said, his voice rough. "Oh." They stood there under the cottonwoods, the creek singing over stones, the last light fading from the sky, and Eleanor felt the future crack open. Not the future she'd imagined back in Missouri. That had been so small, so limited. But this future, vast and uncertain and full of potential. "I care about you too," she said. "I have for a while. I just didn't know if I was allowed to." "Allowed?" "You hired me to be a mother to James, a partner in running the ranch, not to want more." "What if I want more too?" Eleanor's heart hammered. "Then I suppose we figure out what that looks like." They walked back to the house hand in hand, and when they reached Eleanor's bedroom door, Caleb paused. You should know that I'm not—" "Caleb," Eleanor interrupted gently. "Stop talking." She stood on her toes and kissed him again, softer this time, sweeter. When she pulled back, his eyes were dark and full of wonder. "Your room is still your own," he said, "until you decide otherwise. I meant that." "I know you did. That's one of the things I love about you." The word slipped out before she could stop it, but Eleanor didn't take it back. "You keep your promises." "Eleanor." "Good night, Caleb." She slipped into her room before he could say more, her heart racing, her lips still tingling from his kiss. She'd said she loved him, and God help her, she meant it. The change between them was subtle but profound. Caleb started finding excuses to touch her, a hand on her back as he passed, fingers brushing when they both reached for the coffee pot, his shoulder pressed against hers when they reviewed accounts. Eleanor leaned into these touches, hungry for them in ways that surprised her. James noticed, of course. Children always noticed. "Pa's smiling more," he observed one afternoon while helping Eleanor shell peas. "He used to smile before Ma died, but then he stopped. Now he's starting again." "Does that bother you?" Eleanor asked carefully. James considered this seriously, as he considered everything. "I thought it would. I thought if Pa was happy again, it meant he forgot Ma. But I don't think that's how it works." "No?" "Miss Patterson says people's hearts aren't like buckets that can only hold so much. She says they're more like how you can always love one more baby, even if you already have other children. There's always room for more love. It doesn't push out the old love." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "Miss Patterson sounds very wise." "She is.
She also said, James paused, his small face serious. She said it's okay if I love you and still miss Ma, that I'm not being disloyal. Oh, James, Eleanor pulled him close. You're not being disloyal. Your mother will always be your mother. I'm just... You're Eleanor. You're now Ma. Remember? I remember. He hugged her tight. I'm glad you stayed. I'm glad you're here. Me too, sweetheart. Me too. May brought new challenges. A fence broke and cattle scattered, requiring 3 days of hard riding to round them all up. Bill Thompson took sick with what Eleanor feared was pneumonia, though it turned out to be just a bad chest cold. A late frost threatened the garden Eleanor had so carefully planted, sending her and James scrambling to cover everything with old blankets. Through it all, Eleanor and Caleb moved as a team. When he was exhausted, she was steady. When she was overwhelmed, he was calm. They balanced each other, complemented each other, completed each other in ways that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with partnership. But the romance was growing too. Stolen kisses in the barn, hands held under the table at supper. The way Caleb looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, like she was something precious, something chosen, something cherished. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Caleb said quietly, I'm ready. Eleanor knew immediately what he meant. Her heart began to race. Are you sure? I've been thinking about it for weeks, wanting it for weeks. He turned to face her. I want you in my bed, Eleanor, in my life completely, not just as my wife on paper, but as my wife in truth. Eleanor felt heat flood through her. I want that too. You're sure? Because there's no rush. I can wait as long as you need. I don't want to wait. She met his eyes steadily. I want to be your wife in every way. I want to build this life with you completely. That night, for the first time, Eleanor didn't go to her own room. She followed Caleb to theirs, and discovered that physical love, when built on respect and partnership and genuine affection, was nothing like the cold duty her mother had described. It was awkward at times, yes, and uncertain. But it was also tender and sweet and surprisingly joyful. Afterward, lying in Caleb's arms in the darkness, Eleanor felt something settle deep in her bones. This was home. This man, this child, this ranch, this life. All of it. Home. I love you, Caleb murmured into her hair. I should have said it before, but I'm saying it now. I love you, Eleanor. I love you too. And saying it felt like coming home in a different way. I think I have for months. I was just afraid to admit it. Afraid of what? Afraid it wasn't allowed. Afraid you'd only ever love Sarah. Afraid I wasn't enough. Caleb tightened his arms around her. You're more than enough. You're everything I didn't know I needed. They fell asleep tangled together, and when Eleanor woke in the morning to find Caleb watching her with soft eyes, she felt a happiness so complete it almost frightened her. Summer arrived with long, hot days and the constant work of maintaining a ranch. The garden flourished under Eleanor's care, providing fresh vegetables for the table and reminding her of her mother's garden back in Missouri, though she tried not to think of Missouri too often. That life felt like it belonged to someone else. She wrote to Margaret occasionally, careful letters that described her new life without revealing too much of her growing happiness. Margaret's responses were warm but wistful, describing Catherine's marriage to Thomas Whitmore, which was already showing signs of strain, and Violet's engagement to the banker's son, who turned out to have debts no one had known about. You were smarter than the rest of us, Margaret wrote in one letter. You chose honesty over appearances. I'm beginning to think that was the wiser path. Eleanor folded the letter away, feeling a pang of sympathy for her sisters. They'd gotten what they wanted, handsome husbands, social status, pretty houses. But had they gotten happiness? Had they gotten partnership and purpose and the deep satisfaction of building something real? She doubted it. In June, Lucy Morrison came to visit with news that she was expecting another baby. She and Eleanor sat in the kitchen shelling peas while the children played outside. You look different, Lucy observed. Happier, more settled. Eleanor smiled. I am happy. Happier than I ever thought possible. I'm glad. I worried about you at first, city girl coming to the frontier, marrying a widower with a child.
Seemed like a recipe for disaster. Lucy paused. But you've proven me wrong. You've made a real life here. I've tried. Oh, you've done more than try. You've succeeded. Lucy's expression turned mischievous. And unless I'm much mistaken, you and Caleb have moved beyond partnership into something warmer. Eleanor felt herself flush. Is it that obvious? Only to anyone with eyes. The man can't stop looking at you, and you glow whenever he's near. Lucy patted her hand. It's lovely to see. Caleb deserves happiness. So do you. That night, as Eleanor and Caleb lay in bed, she told him about Lucy's observation. He laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest where Eleanor's head rested. I do look at you constantly, he admitted. Can't seem to help it. You've become the center of my world. You're the center of mine too. They were quiet for a moment. Then Caleb said, I want to ask you something, but I don't want you to feel pressured. Eleanor lifted her head to look at him. What is it? Would you want children? With me, I mean. More children. Eleanor's breath caught. She'd thought about it, of course, lying in his arms, feeling the evidence of their lovemaking, wondering if a child might result. But they'd been careful, and she'd assumed Caleb wasn't ready for more children after losing his daughter. I would, she said carefully. But only if you're ready. I know losing your daughter was... It was devastating, Caleb said quietly. The worst thing I've ever experienced, losing both Sarah and the baby in one terrible night. I told myself I'd never risk that again. He cupped her face gently. But I'm ready to try again. With you. If you're willing. Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks. I'm willing. I'd love to have your child. They stopped being careful after that, and Eleanor waited each month with a mixture of hope and fear. But summer passed into fall without any sign of pregnancy, and she tried not to feel disappointed. These things take time, Caleb reassured her. We'll keep trying. October brought the first anniversary of Eleanor's arrival in Wyoming. She woke on the anniversary of her wedding to find Caleb already up, standing by the window looking out at the ranch. Hard to believe it's been a year, he said, when he noticed she was awake. A year since I arrived as a mail-order bride. A stranger. And now? Eleanor got out of bed and moved to stand beside him, looking out at the land she'd come to love. Now I'm home. He kissed her temple. Yes, you are. That evening, the whole household celebrated. Caleb, Eleanor, James, and the Hands. Eleanor had made a special dinner, and afterward James presented her with a drawing he'd made at school, showing the ranch house with Eleanor, Caleb, and himself standing in front of it. Above them, he'd written in careful letters, My family. Eleanor hung it in the kitchen where everyone could see it. November brought the news that changed everything. Eleanor had been feeling off for weeks, tired, queasy, emotional. She'd assumed it was just the change of seasons or perhaps a mild illness. But when Lucy Morrison came to visit and took one look at her, the older woman smiled knowingly. You're expecting, Lucy said with certainty. I'm... what? No, I'm just tired. Tired, queasy, emotional, and if I'm not mistaken, your monthlies are late. Lucy squeezed her hand. I've had 2 babies, Eleanor. I know the signs. You're expecting. The news left Eleanor reeling. A baby. She was going to have a baby. Caleb's baby. She waited until that evening to tell him, nervous despite knowing he wanted this. They were in their bedroom, preparing for sleep, when she finally found the courage. Caleb, I need to tell you something. He heard the seriousness in her tone and immediately gave her his full attention. What is it? I'm pregnant. She watched his face carefully. Lucy Morrison says she's certain, and I think she's right. All the signs are there. For a moment, Caleb just stared at her. Then his face crumpled, not with sadness, but with overwhelming emotion. He pulled her into his arms and held her so tight she could barely breathe. Are you happy? She whispered. Happy? His voice was thick. Eleanor, I'm terrified and overjoyed and grateful and scared out of my mind, but yes, I'm happy. I'm scared too, she admitted. What if something goes wrong? What if I can't? Don't borrow trouble. He pulled back to look at her, his hands gentle on her face. We'll take it one day at a time. We'll get the best midwife. We'll be careful, and we'll face whatever comes together. When they told James the next morning, his reaction was pure joy. A baby? Really? Will it be a brother or a sister? We won't know until it arrives, Eleanor said, laughing at his enthusiasm. Either one is good. Tommy Morrison has a baby sister, and he says she's annoying but also kind of fun. And Sarah Chen has a baby brother who spits up a lot. James considered this seriously. I'll teach the baby things, like how to name chickens and skip rocks and tell which cows are friendly. Eleanor pulled him into a hug, her heart overflowing. This boy who'd been so cautious about letting her in was now excited about being a big brother. They were a family, truly a family, and growing. Winter came again, but this year Eleanor knew what to expect. She'd stockpiled reading material, planned projects, and prepared for the isolation. And this year, she had the baby to think about, knitting tiny clothes, preparing a cradle, imagining the child that would fill their home with new life come summer. The pregnancy was not easy. Eleanor suffered from morning sickness that lasted all day, exhaustion that made simple tasks feel monumental, and toward the end, a backache that never quite went away. But Caleb was attentive, the hands were respectful, and James was excited enough for all of them. In March, during a late-night conversation by the fire, Caleb brought up something that had clearly been weighing on him. I need to tell you about Sarah's death, he said, about what happened. You should know in case there are decisions to be made. Eleanor's hand instinctively went to her swollen belly. All right. The labor started normal. Hard, but normal. But then something went wrong. The baby was positioned wrong, the midwife said, and Sarah was bleeding too much. They tried to turn the baby, tried everything, but he swallowed hard. By the time it was over, we'd lost them both. Sarah and our daughter. I'm so sorry, Eleanor whispered. The midwife said there was nothing anyone could have done differently, that sometimes it just happens. But I've always wondered if we'd been in a city with real doctors, if maybe... He shook his head. I need you to promise me something. If there are complications, if it comes down to choosing between you and the baby, you tell them to save you. Eleanor's eyes widened. Caleb, promise me, Eleanor. I can't lose you. James can't lose you. We need you. His eyes were fierce. I love our baby already, but I love you more. I choose you. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face. I choose you too, and I promise, if it comes to that, I'll tell them to save me. They held each other in the firelight, two people who'd married as strangers and become everything to each other, facing the uncertain future with courage born of love. The baby came in early June, 3 weeks before Eleanor expected. She woke in the night with pains she initially dismissed as false labor, but by dawn it was clear this was the real thing. Caleb sent Bill Thompson racing to town for the midwife, while he and Charlie did their best to keep Eleanor comfortable and calm. James, terrified and excited in equal measure, was sent to stay with the Morrisons. The labor was long and hard, testing Eleanor's endurance in ways she'd never imagined. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Fletcher, who delivered half the babies in the territory, was calm and competent, but Eleanor could see the concern in her eyes as hours stretched into more hours. The baby's positioned wrong, Mrs. Fletcher said quietly to Caleb, not realizing Eleanor could hear. I'm going to have to turn it. It won't be pleasant. Caleb knelt beside Eleanor, taking her hand. You can do this. You're the strongest person I know. I'm scared, Eleanor gasped between contractions. I know, I'm scared too. But we're doing this together, remember? Everything together. Mrs. Fletcher did what needed to be done, and Eleanor screamed through pain she hadn't known existed. But finally, she felt the baby shift, and then the overwhelming urge to push. That's it, Mrs. Fletcher encouraged. Good girl. Again, push. Eleanor pushed with everything she had, Caleb's hand crushing hers, sweat pouring down her face. Her entire world narrowed to this moment, this effort, this desperate need to bring her child into the world. And then, a cry. Thin and wavering, but unmistakably alive. It's a girl, Mrs. Fletcher announced, her voice warm with relief. A perfect, healthy baby girl. Eleanor sobbed as they placed the baby on her chest, tiny and red and furious at her sudden eviction into the cold world. But alive, breathing, perfect. Caleb's tears fell onto Eleanor's face as he leaned over them both. She's beautiful. You're beautiful. You did it, Eleanor. You did it. We did it, Eleanor whispered, looking from her daughter to her husband. Together. They named her Sarah for the woman who'd come before, but gave her the middle name Eleanor, binding past and present together. Little Sarah Eleanor Ridgway, who had her father's dark hair and her mother's determined chin and her own fierce personality from the very beginning. James, when he finally met his sister, was awestruck. She's so small and loud. All babies are small and loud, Eleanor said, smiling at his wonder. You were too once. Can I hold her? Eleanor showed him how, carefully positioning his arms, and watched her son, because he was her son now, truly, cradle his baby sister with the utmost gentleness. I'm going to teach you everything, James told the baby seriously. And I'll protect you from cows that aren't friendly and make sure you know all the best places to explore and tell you stories about dragons who are afraid of heights. Caleb met Eleanor's eyes over the children's heads, and the love in his gaze was so profound it took her breath away. This was her family, built from a cruel joke, from desperation and pragmatism, from honest letters and careful choices. Built day by day, brick by brick, choice by choice. Not perfect. No family was perfect, but real and strong and full of love. Summer passed in a blur of sleepless nights and joyful days. Eleanor learned to nurse the baby, to soothe her cries, to function on minimal sleep. Caleb helped with everything, changing diapers without complaint, and walking the floor with Sarah when Eleanor was too exhausted. The hands stopped by to offer gruff congratulations and hand-carved toys. The community celebrated with them, bringing food and gifts and advice. Mrs. Chen came to visit in July, making the journey from Cheyenne to meet her granddaughter's namesake. She sat with Eleanor on the porch, watching Caleb play with James and baby Sarah on the grass, and smiled. You chose partnership, she said, and you built love from it, just like I told you to. You were right, Eleanor said, about everything. I usually am. Mrs. Chen squeezed her hand. You look happy, truly happy. I am. I didn't know I could be this happy. One evening in late August, as Eleanor sat in Sarah's old bench under the cottonwoods nursing her daughter, Caleb came to sit beside her. James was catching fireflies nearby, his laughter carrying across the creek. I've been thinking about your sisters, Caleb said, about the joke that brought you here. Eleanor shifted baby Sarah to her other breast. What about it? I want to thank them for being cruel enough to give you a reason to leave, for not appreciating what they had in you. He put his arm around her shoulders. Because their loss is my gain. Their joke became my blessing. Our blessing, Eleanor corrected, leaning into him. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if they hadn't sent that letter? If you'd stayed in Missouri? Eleanor considered this. Sometimes, but then I look at this life, at you and James and Sarah, at this ranch, at the person I've become, and I can't regret anything that brought me here. Even the pain of being invisible all those years, because it taught me to value being seen. You're seen now, Caleb said softly. By me, by James, by everyone who matters. You're the heart of this ranch, Eleanor. The center everything revolves around. Baby Sarah finished nursing and let out a satisfied burp that made them both laugh. James ran over, his jar of fireflies glowing softly in the twilight. Look how many I caught. Can I keep them? Just for tonight, Eleanor said. Tomorrow you let them go. Why? Because beautiful things deserve to be free, she said, meeting Caleb's eyes. Not trapped. Later that night, after James and Sarah were asleep and the house was quiet, Eleanor and Caleb lay in bed talking softly. Do you know what today is? Eleanor asked. Tuesday? She laughed. It's been exactly 2 years since I answered your first letter. 2 years since I decided to take a chance on a stranger in Wyoming. Caleb pulled her close. Best decision I ever made, advertising for a wife. Best decision you ever made, answering. No, Eleanor said, kissing him softly. The best decision I made was staying, was choosing this life every single day since I arrived. was choosing you and James and this ranch and the person I am here. And I choose you, Caleb said, every day, for the rest of my life. They made love slowly, tenderly, mindful of the baby sleeping in her cradle nearby. And afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her here. From invisible daughter to mail-order bride to essential partner to beloved wife and mother. From Eleanor Hale, the plain one, the joke, the burden, to Eleanor Ridgway, the heart of a ranch, the center of a family, the woman who was finally truly seen. Years passed and the ranch thrived. James grew into a capable young man who loved the land as much as his father did. Sarah grew into a spirited little girl with her mother's stubbornness and her father's steady heart. And Eleanor and Caleb grew older together, their love deepening with time, built on the solid foundation of partnership and respect and daily choosing each other. On their 10th anniversary, Caleb surprised Eleanor with a second bench, a matching one to Sarah's, carved with new initials, CR plus ER. Both loves deserve to be honored, he said simply. The one that shaped my past and the one that made my future. They sat on Eleanor's bench together, watching their children play, and Eleanor thought about that terrified girl who'd stepped off the train in Sweetwater a decade ago. How far she'd come, how much she'd grown, how completely this life had transformed her. "Do you ever miss Missouri?" Caleb asked, echoing a question from years before. Eleanor shook her head. "Missouri was never home. This is home. You are home." And it was true. This ranch, with its vast skies and brutal winters and endless work, this man with his calloused hands and honest heart. These children who called her Ma and needed her and loved her. This community that had welcomed her and valued her. This life she'd built from nothing but courage and hope and the willingness to risk everything for the chance at something real. She'd been sent west as a joke, the ugly daughter, the unwanted burden, the laughingstock her sisters had never expected to actually marry. But she'd become something her sisters with their beauty and their proper marriages would never understand. She'd become essential, she'd become chosen, she'd become loved, not for her face or her father's name or what she could provide others, but for exactly who she was. Eleanor Ridgway, rancher's wife, mother, partner, friend. The woman who knew stories and kept accounts, and could deliver a calf and mend a fence and make a house a home. The woman who had finally, blessedly, found where she belonged. And as the sun set over the Wyoming prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Eleanor leaned into her husband's solid warmth and smiled. She was home. She was seen. She was loved. And that was more than enough. That was everything.